Welcome back for the afternoon session, which will be on emergence. You may have a question in your mind as to why emergence shows up as a topic, as one of the main headings for the symposium. Just a little bit of perspective. A little over 100 years ago, as quantum mechanics was developed, it was quite mysterious, and it completely changed the way people think about the natural world and the universe. And now, all these years later, we're still struggling to really understand it. I have a nice quote here that Einstein sent in a letter to Schrödinger. This was 1950, so about halfway through this period. But he said, "It is quite hard to accept that we are still in the stage of babies in their diapers. And it is not surprising that the fellows are unwilling to admit this, even to themselves." It is hard to admit these major changes that happen. Another change that I think has happened since quantum mechanics has been this whole study of nonlinear dynamics and self-organization. And I tried to talk about that a little in the introduction yesterday, how we've moved from these models of linear causality to circular causality, and what this means and what it suggests, and what it means about novelty in the universe, and how we really understand how things come about and how things evolve, and just a whole new view and understanding. And this is particularly important when we try to take on a subject like free will, because as mentioned already, physics doesn't really provide us with any kind of model for novelty before we come to, for organized novelty, I should say, before we come to emergence. Now, you can have randomness and quantum fluctuations, but they're by definition random. And whereas self-organizing and emergent systems follow behaviors that are novel and specific, and as I said, really change the way we look at things. So we have an interesting program today. I think it's going to be a lot of fun this afternoon. Our first speaker will be Evan Thompson. And just a little bit about Evan, who's right here. He's professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto. His main areas of research are cognitive science, phenomenology, and the philosophy of mind. His books include Mind in Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind. That's Harvard University Press. Color Vision, a study in cognitive science and the philosophy of perception. The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience, which he co-authored with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche. And he is also co-editor with Philip David Zalazzo and Morris Moscovich of the Cambridge Handbook of Consciousness. So please join me in welcoming Evan Thompson.
Let me just take a minute to get this up properly. There we go. Can everybody hear me? Good. Well, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here and to speak to you this afternoon. The title of my talk is a little bit different from the title on the schedule that was circulated, but really the material is basically the same. I'm just compulsive with titles and constantly change them. To begin, I would like to show you this picture, which is an image of a Tibetan Buddhist monk in the laboratory of Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin. And he is wearing a cap made up of electrodes, a dense array EEG cap that records electrical activity at the scalp associated with the underlying activity of the brain, particularly of the cortical structures of the brain. So what I want to talk to you about today is the relevance of this kind of research on the neural correlates of contemplative mental training, the relevance of this sort of research for our theme of free will and neuroscience. And in the interests of, I suppose you could say, full disclosure, I'd like to say why this is important to me and where I'm coming from. My guiding motivation is that combining mind-brain science and contemplative experience holds the promise or raises the prospect of a new kind of self-knowledge, really a kind of self-knowledge that's unprecedented from both the point of view of the Western scientific tradition and from the point of view of the Asian contemplative traditions. And I want to examine volition. I'll say what I mean specifically about by volition in a minute. I want to examine volition specifically from this standpoint. And just to give this a bit of a broader contextual framing, why is this important? Speaking personally now, it seems to me that there are really two regressive tendencies that mark our era. I'm thinking in particular of the dialogue involving science and religion and science and spirituality. So on the one hand, we have the resurgence of a kind of religious extremism with various outmoded belief systems. And on the other hand, we have the entrenchment of scientific reductionism, a kind of hard-nosed scientific reductionism, exemplified, for example, by Dawkins and Dennett and others. And the problem with both of these extremes is that neither recognizes the value of the contemplative mind as a source of wisdom and well-being, and as a source of knowledge relevant to mind-brain science. So my hope is to work towards an alternative to these extremes that integrates mind-brain science and contemplative knowledge, and it's from this standpoint that I want to address the topic of volition and consciousness. Okay, so let's start with the question of what is volition. And like Alan Wallace, I'm a great admirer of William James. So I want to read to you a few things William James had to say about volition. This is from the Principles of Psychology. He said, "We reach the heart of our inquiry." This is in his chapter on the will. "We reach the heart of our inquiry into volition when we ask by what process it is that the thought of any given object comes to prevail stably in the mind. Attention with effort is all that any case of volition implies." And I think you can hear the resonance immediately of this thought with what Alan was talking about earlier today. James continued, he said, "The essential achievement of the will, in short, when it is most voluntary, is to attend," and those are James's capital letters, "is to attend to a difficult object and hold it fast before the mind. Effort of attention is thus the essential phenomenon of will." Now, I think this point is important because, going back to some things that were also said earlier today, we can easily fall into the trap of reifying the notion of the will and the notion of free will. And if we ask ourselves what experientially or what phenomenologically we might mean by free will, then it seems to me that James really goes to the heart of it here, that effort of attention is the essential phenomenon of will, the ability to hold the attention on a chosen object, and to switch the attention to a chosen object and hold it there. Okay, so given that notion, I want to proceed, and so you can keep track, and so I can keep track of where we are. This is the framework for what I want to present to you today. I want to say some things, philosophical things, I suppose you could say, about relating mind and brain, or methodological, epistemological points about the task of relating mind and brain. And then I want to spend some time talking about contemplative neuroscience, by which I mean research involving neuroscience and meditation, contemplative mind training. And then towards the end, I want to direct the discussion pointedly to the topic of volition and the concept of emergence that is the theme for or one of the themes for our afternoon. Okay, so first then, relating mind and brain. And when I use mind here, I'm really thinking of the experiential mind. This is a way of picturing what's going on in neuroscience at the moment when, speaking from a neuroscientific point of view, we investigate the relationship between various kinds of mental functions or various kinds of experiences and the brain. What we're actually interested in as scientists is this area here, that is the relationship between experience and brain activity. But it's very important to realize that we don't actually work directly with either of those. Rather, what we work with on the brain side is one or another measure of brain activity. So we have various windows onto the brain. For example, here, this is EEG electrodes, which are picking up oscillatory signals in a given frequency, which for a particular window of time might exhibit a particular pattern of synchrony. And that's going to be important for some things I say later on. So we have one or another window on the brain. On the side of experience, and I'm sorry, but this seems to be cutting off my slide. Well, it's cutting it off over there too. On the side of experience, we work with various reports, various first-person reports of experience. And there are a whole host of questions we can ask in psychology about the status of first-person reports. So we're working then at a remove from what ultimately we're interested in. Now, in this picture, these things are all represented on the same level. But that's actually really not accurate, because this is really a better way of thinking about what's going on. We're working at the level of what we could call a kind of pragmatic correlation, correlations we establish pragmatically in the context of experimental research between brain measures and self-reports. The principal correlations we're interested in are the experience and the brain activity. There's a process of transformation leading from the brain activity to the measure, whether it's EEG or PET or fMRI, and we can think of this as involving some kind of black box that takes a signal and transforms it into something that we can model and represent. Similarly, in the case of experience and self-report, we can think of there being some kind of process of transformation, or some transformation is maybe not the word I want to use, some process whereby a report is given or elicited on the basis of experience. And that movement or process involves what we could also think of as a kind of phenomenological zone. The pragmatic correlation is at the level of knowledge. What we're trying to get at is what we could characterize as the ontology or the world or nature. But it's very important to realize that we're working with this. Now, why am I going into this? Because yesterday we were given a picture of fMRI, for example, as giving us a direct snapshot and window onto the brain. But this is actually highly misleading, because that's not what is going on in fMRI, and it's really, I think, important for us to realize this. I'm not going to go through all these steps, but it's important to realize that with an fMRI image, there's a complex process of transformation and data manipulation and tuning of parameters, so that what you get at the end, some statistically significant hotspot, is not a picture or a snapshot or an image. It's a statistical reconstruction of something that involves relating the brain that you're imaging to some standardized image of the brain that's in Montreal at the Montreal Neurological Institute, or that's in Paris. It doesn't take into account individual variability in development. It's a statistical reconstruction. And it's, I think, really fundamental to emphasize this, because what it means is that we're not looking directly at brain activity. Similarly, on the experiential side, we're not getting direct readouts of subjective experience with self-reports. What we're doing is we're working with various kinds of representations, interventions, and interpretations from multiple perspectives. That is, from the first-person perspective that leads to the production of the experiential report, the second-person perspective of the psychologist or the neuroscientist who gives the experimental participant a script or set of questions to answer that involves a kind of second-person intersubjective interaction, and then from the third person, where we have the complex biobehavioral perspective of neuroimaging and button-pressing reaction times and things of that sort. So to summarize all that, we're working within a domain of highly mediated knowledge production. Now that raises some interesting questions. Neuroscience has made huge advances on the third person side, what we could call, what I was calling before, the black box of brain recording. That is, we have techniques like fMRI, EEG, MEG, PET, and so on, which we understand in many ways. There are open questions about them, but we understand them in many ways, what they record, what we have to do to produce the statistically significant results that we get. So we have a pretty good understanding of the black box of brain recording. But now question, can we also refine our methods on the first-person side? Can we work on the phenomenological side, or what I'm calling the black box of phenomenology? Can we work in a way to enhance and enrich the phenomenological perspective? And we could formulate that question in the form of a working assumption. And these working assumptions are what lie behind what some of us, drawing on Francisco Varela's work, think of as neurophenomenology. So the working assumptions would be that the ability to monitor and describe experience is flexible and trainable. It can be conceptualized, in other words, as a skill. And in particular, then, using contemplative methods of training attention, awareness, and emotion, we may be able to uncover new information about experience, so new phenomenological information, you could say, and phenomenological information that's relevant to understanding what's going on in the brain. So new neural information and new phenomenological information. And this is really the idea behind what Francisco Varela proposed as neurophenomenology. He talked about a reciprocal relation or mutual circulation between the phenomenological pole and the neuroscientific pole. And in the context of the talk today, the phenomenological pole that I'm going to be, the aspect of the phenomenological pole that I'm going to be focusing on is going to be concerning work on meditation. But there are other things that could play the phenomenological role as well. But I'm focusing on meditation for reasons having to do with our theme of volition, as you'll see towards the end. Okay, so those are some remarks about how to think about what's going on in this project of relating neuroscience, or relating mind and brain, or relating neuroscience and phenomenology. And what I want to do now is to look at some research in what some of us are calling contemplative neuroscience that concerns two aspects of experience: the self, the experience of self, and I'm going to also talk about some work that's done on the neurodynamics of consciousness, in particular the neurodynamics of a particular kind of meditative state. Okay, so if we were to ask the question, when you are aware of yourself, what exactly are you aware of? There's probably a whole range of different things that we could say, or that question would elicit. It's a very rich question. In psychology and in phenomenology, going back to James, a distinction has been made, and this is in the first instance a phenomenological distinction. A distinction has been made between two modes of self-awareness: what we could call awareness that's present-centered, and awareness that's temporally extended and that takes the form of narrative thinking and narrative feeling and emotion. So the present moment awareness is what William James called the I, the sense of self in the present moment, in the act of feeling or knowing or thinking. And both James and phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty emphasize that this is body-anchored in the sense that it's pervaded by a feeling of one's living body, or what the phenomenologists would call the non-objective lived body, the body that's lived through an experience. More recently, Damasio has talked about this as a kind of core self or core consciousness. By contrast, there's the sense of self that involves oneself over time. Memory and expectation, that is backwards-looking, forward-looking. James talked about this as a sense of me that is continuous across time. It also involves metacognition, that is being able to direct one's thoughts to one's own mental states, to remember one's past experiences and anticipate one's future experiences. Psychologists also talk about this as a kind of mental time traveling, projecting yourself into the past or recalling the past, projecting yourself into the future. And Damasio has talked about this as a kind of autobiographical sense of self, or extended, temporally extended consciousness. So this is a distinction then between two modes of self-awareness that is at root a phenomenological distinction, an experiential distinction. Now, these two ways of experiencing oneself are completely confounded in everyday experience. By that I mean they're completely mixed together. We experience ourselves now. We have a sense of ourselves standing here and speaking, or sitting in the chair, listening to the words, but we also daydream, our minds wander, we think, we ruminate, we time travel incessantly. We mentally rehearse what we want to say, or we go over what we think we should have said. So this connects with some of the things that we were talking about earlier today in terms of planning, among other things. But these two things are completely mixed together in any given moment. Any given moment of experience, you will find, I think most typically, a mixture of these things. So the question then arises, if present moment self-awareness and narrative self-awareness are mixed together, can we disentangle them? Now that actually can be raised as a question for neuroscience. Can we illuminate brain activity in the resting attention state? That's the state when you're not, say, performing some goal-directed task, but you're simply resting between trials, and neuroscientists have gotten very interested in this in relation to what's called the default mode of brain activity. So can we illuminate the activity in the so-called resting attention state, where these things seem to be mixed together, the time traveling and the present-centered awareness? Well, from a neurophenomenological point of view, here's how we might think about doing that. We could build this phenomenological distinction between these two modes of self-awareness into the design of an experiment. So this is what is sometimes called front-loading phenomenology into experimental design. The distinction here being these ones for two modes of self-awareness, but there are other distinctions, phenomenological distinctions, that we could employ experimentally as well. And we could use first-person methods to train subjects or participants so they can make this distinction flexibly in their own experience. And one way that we could do this is by drawing on certain kinds of contemplative practices. I'm thinking in particular of what is sometimes called open monitoring meditation, which is the cultivation of a kind of awareness of what arises from moment to moment without preferentially anchoring attention in any one place. Alan could describe this much better than I could, but a kind of open awareness that is alert and sensitive to whatever arises, but doesn't react to it cognitively or emotionally. And when the mind wanders, takes note of the wandering and returns the attention to that sense of being in the present. So, of course, cognitive appraisals and emotions are going to arise, but the idea is to notice their arising and to release them without engaging in some kind of good or bad evaluation or some kind of movement towards or movement away. So it would be, and as I understand it, Alan could describe this much better than I could, this would be one of the things that Vipassana trains, would be this, yes. Okay, so then some new questions. Can meditation, and I'm thinking specifically now of this type of meditation, because meditation means any number of things. Can this kind of open monitoring meditation help to disentangle these two modes of self-awareness at the level of the brain? Can training in this meditation reveal the neural networks associated with present moment self-awareness by contrast with narrative self-awareness? Again, because these two things are typically mixed together and we want to be able to disentangle them. Well, this is exactly what was done in a study carried out by some colleagues of mine at the University of Toronto in the psychology department, the laboratory of Adam Anderson. And this was a study that was presented this year in which they used mindfulness meditation, or more specifically, individuals trained in the mindfulness-based stress reduction program to look at these distinct neural modes of self-reference, of the experiential sense of self and the narrative sense of self. So what I want to do is actually describe this experiment in a little bit of detail. Okay, so the task was to adopt either what they called experiential self-focus, which is present-centered awareness, or to adopt a narrative self-focus, focusing on one's sense of self over time, while reading words that are personality trait adjectives. So these would be words that would have various kinds of positive and negative valence, you could say. So negative would be nervous, cowardly, indecisive. By contrast, positive would be powerful, energetic, hopeful. So this is a so-called event-related paradigm where you're presenting these words, you're reading these words in one or the other of two mental sets, a kind of present-centered awareness or a narrative self-focus, where when you're in the narrative self-focus, the idea is to read the word and to ask yourself, well, what does this word signify in relation to me? Am I nervous, typically? Am I hopeful? What have I done in the past that might, meet that the meaning of that word, or how might I act in such a way in the future? That would be the narrative mode of reading the words. Whereas the experiential self-focus is to read the word and simply to be present with one's, you could say, immediate reaction, one's visceral response, if you like, to the word, but without getting caught up in some kind of evaluation of that or some sort of narrative thinking about the meaning of the word. And if one does become caught up in that, to return one's attention simply to being present in the moment, given that word in front of one. Now, what they looked at was they contrasted individuals who had an 8-week training course in mindfulness-based stress reduction with individuals with no training in any type of meditation, and they contrasted these two groups of individuals in this experimental paradigm. So what did they find? Well, what they found in general is that the narrative self-focus engages areas of the brain that have to do that are located along the midline of the cortex, so especially the medial prefrontal cortex. And we know that these areas of the brain, I'm speaking very generally now, are associated with evaluation of the self. So that's in the narrative self-focus. By contrast, the experiential self-focus yields reductions in these areas. We see reduced activity in these sort of narrative thinking self-evaluation cortical regions. But more interestingly, when we look at the meditators compared with the non-meditators, and these, remember, are individuals only with an 8-week training course, so these are not long-term meditators, but already in these individuals, we see that the experiential focus yields significant reductions, marked and pervasive reductions in medial prefrontal cortex, and increased engagement of areas that have to do with bodily awareness in the present moment. So right lateral prefrontal cortex and insula, secondary somatosensory cortex, areas that are, you could characterize them as viscerosomatic in very general terms. Moreover, there was an uncoupling, a decorrelation between the activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and in these viscerosomatic areas in the meditators, but not in the non-meditators. So one way to think about this might be something like the narrative thinking that's going on in the case of the meditators is taken note of, but there's a more flexible return to an awareness in the present moment that's simply awareness in the now rather than some kind of visceral response that's caught up with the narrative thinking. And so this is the pattern we see in the meditators, but we don't see this in the non-meditators. So in the non-meditators, there really isn't a very interesting difference in the brain activity between the experiential focus and the narrative self-focus. Whereas in the individuals with the meditative training, there is quite a significant difference in terms of the neural networks associated with self-awareness that we see arising. Okay, so the upshot then is that the individuals with training in open monitoring meditation seem better able to move flexibly between these two kinds of self-awareness, and imaging their brains reveals then distinct networks engaged in self-awareness in the present moment and across time. Meditation also seems to be able to alter the brain activity in the resting attention mode. So simply to say resting attention, that could mean any number of things. It could mean being caught up in rumination, or it could mean simply being aware of oneself in the present moment. And specifically, this type of training seems to facilitate voluntary attention, voluntary shifting of attention and regulation of emotion, because that's what's going on in the experiential self-focus. You're returning attention to the present moment voluntarily, and you're regulating emotional responses by noticing an emotional response, but not evaluating it as good or bad, but simply taking note of it, keeping attention in the present moment. Okay, so just to maybe insist on the point then, what we see here is that a certain kind of phenomenological training is able to, it gives individuals the capacity to flexibly move between different forms of experience and to describe them and report them. and correspondingly then is able to reveal patterns in brain activity that we would otherwise miss without that kind of cognitive and emotional flexibility. So this is enriching the phenomenological side. Okay, so the second example that I want to use, and this is going to lead into the discussion of emergence, has to do with the neurodynamics of consciousness, the dynamical brain activity associated with consciousness, in particular associated with the study of a meditative state. Now, in order to describe this, I need to give a little bit of background, general sort of neuroscience background. The working assumption behind this research is that individuals who can generate and maintain various types of mental states or contemplative mental states and can describe them with a fair degree of precision provide a new way to study how mental processes are related to large-scale dynamical brain activity. So I need to say something about what I mean by large-scale dynamical brain activity. Now, we're familiar, especially from yesterday's lectures, with the idea that the brain is specialized regionally, so that the brain isn't a homogeneous mass of tissue, but there's differentiation of cell types, differentiation of regions and structures that are preferentially mobilized, you could say, in different mental activities. So there are areas that are concerned with vision, visual perception, visual mental imagery, with attention and self-awareness. We've seen some examples of that already in the previous study. So we're familiar with this idea of regional specialization. But the flip side of that is, how do these different regions organize their activities cooperatively? How do they interact cooperatively to form large-scale patterns where things hold together in the right way, so that the sound of my voice goes together with the movement of my lips and is coherent with your sitting and being aware of being in this room and being in the chair? How is all that orchestrated by the brain on a millisecond time scale? That is known as the large-scale integration problem. And it's really a dynamical problem because it involves activity over time. One of the working hypotheses in this area of research is that one indication of this integration, that this integration is happening, or perhaps a mechanism, though this is debated, is what's called transient synchronization. The idea here is that there are different rhythms of activity in the brain in different frequencies, and within a certain window of time, there may be a coupling among those frequencies with a relationship of being in phase or out of phase. So there's a kind of phase synchrony that can arise transiently and then fall apart and then arise again, and that this synchrony may perhaps be a kind of glue for this large-scale integration. One hypothesis that's being put forward is that this kind of transient long-distance synchrony, long distance means over widely separated areas, is that this kind of transient long-distance synchrony is actually a correlate of conscious mental activity. So here we have, as seen in EEG, we have oscillatory activity being recorded at electrodes. Within a certain window, there's a constant phase relationship or a phase synchrony, and this has been associated, say, in the fast gamma frequency range with things like attention, working memory, the binding of perceptual attributes. So the idea is that this kind of synchrony is a way of orchestrating and holding things together within a certain window of time. Okay, so this brings me then to the study, which some of you may be familiar with, which looked at now long-term practitioners in particular Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and it looked at the patterns of synchrony within the frequency range known as the gamma frequency range. This is around 25 to 42 hertz or cycles a second, so it's a fast frequency that we know to be associated with various aspects of waking and alert mental or cognitive activity, things like attention and working memory and so on. What this study did is it contrasted a neutral state, a non-meditative state, with a meditation meditative state, a particular type of meditation that I won't try to describe, that Alan could describe for you, that involves an open awareness infused with a sense or feeling, the affect of compassion, so-called non-referential compassion meditation. So it looked at the contrast between a non-meditative state and the generation of this meditative state in long-term practitioners, individuals with many, many years of practice, a number of retreats, compared with novices who had a week of training before the experiment in this type of meditation. And there were a number of results, but I'll just mention the main one, and that is that in the long-term meditators, what you see are very, very high power or high amplitude oscillations in this gamma frequency range. So if this is the resting state and the meditative state, and so these are the signals, the bursts at the electrodes, so these fast frequency, high power gamma signals. And they're also temporally coordinated, that is, the oscillations within a certain window are in phase, exhibit phase synchrony. So here you see the increase in the amplitude of the gamma, and here you see the increase in the synchrony. This characterizes the EEG for the long-term practitioners, but not for the novices. Now, given that we already know that gamma is significant, gamma activity and gamma phase synchrony is significant in relation to things like working memory, attention, perceptual binding, and so on, that in general terms it's a index, you could say, I suppose, of coherent mental activity. What we see then is that, among other things, this type of meditative state is a highly organized and coherent state from the point of view of EEG. So this is a way in which we see the large-scale integration happening in a way that's completely internally or endogenously generated. There's no perceptual stimulus. It's not under the outside control of the experimenter. It's rather generated from within and self-organized from the cognitive neuroscience point of view. So it's a highly coherent and organized state that shapes neural activity, and that's going to lead in then to this notion of emergence. Okay. How am I doing for time? I lose sense of time completely when I do these things. 5 minutes? Okay, I think I can try and whip through this. Okay, so this is the last thing I want to talk about, the notion of emergence and its relationship to volition. Okay. Kinds of mental states that we've been talking about, or that I've been talking about here. It's important to remember that these mental states are self-generated. By that I mean they are intentionally enacted, intentionally brought about. They arise from within, they're not hold neural activity in place over a certain period of time. So how can we conceptualize this? How can we think about this kind of dynamical phenomenon? Well, let's go back to what I said at the beginning about not looking directly at brain activity and not getting direct readouts of subjective experience. I said we work with representations, interventions, and interpretations from multiple perspectives. And I want to stress the intervention, and you'll see why in a moment. Here's a speculation. The intentional enactment, or we could say the volitional generation of mental states that we see strikingly in the case of meditation, is a first-person way of cognitively intervening in the workings of one's brain at the level of large-scale dynamical activity. So I want to try and conceptualize what we're talking about in terms of a kind of notion of what philosophers would call an interventionist causation. And I'll say some more about that in a moment. In the context of neurodynamics, there are models that propose that intention can be thought of as a kind of large-scale pattern, what's known as an order parameter. This is a collective variable in the sense that it's a variable whose values are set by the order parameter of the system's dynamic. It's a collective variable that constrains the system's behavior by stabilizing or destabilizing it. So here's a sort of take-home way you can think of this in your own case. You're all familiar with this image. You look at it, and it spontaneously shifts in depth. That's a kind of moment of stability, a destabilization, and a reconfiguration into a new pattern. Nothing out there is changing. This is arising from within. It arises, as far as we know, stochastically. It flips back and forth stochastically. But, interesting, you can also make it flip yourself. You can voluntarily induce the flip. So, for example, if you focus your attention here, and you, as it were, mentally imagine pulling that towards you, you can get the cube to flip. So this is an example of a voluntary mental switching, or an intentionally enacted mental switching that makes something out there look different. It changes how the world appears, but nothing out there in the world is changing. Now, I want to relate this to something that's similar, that is a paradigm in neuroscience that is used to look at consciousness and attention, called binocular rivalry. Briefly, in binocular rivalry, you take two different images. These are, you can't really see, but these are vertical lines and horizontal lines. You present each image, you present one image to each eye with a certain setup. And what happens is, rather than fusing, the images will compete with each other for perceptual dominance. So you'll see a kind of patchwork, and then you'll see the horizontal lines, and the vertical will be suppressed, and then you'll see the vertical and the horizontal lines will be suppressed. We know, this takes a moment to load because we know that when this happens, so this corresponds to a moment of perceptual dominance, another moment of perceptual dominance, another moment of perceptual dominance, that when this happens, in the moment of perceptual dominance, we see these widespread patterns of synchrony. So when the image emerges, there's a particular pattern of synchrony in the brain. That synchrony pattern falls apart. The image emerges again. There's a new pattern of synchrony. So this is a large-scale dynamical event in the brain. Now, interestingly, there was a study that was done that looked at binocular rivalry in long-term Tibetan Buddhist monks, practitioners, in the context of a focused attention meditation by comparison with other types of meditation. In the focused attention meditation, where you stabilize your attention single-pointedly on an object, when these individuals were in this meditative state and after they were in it, when they were presented with the binocular rivalry, experiences of seeing the vertical lines in the foreground and the horizontal lines faintly in the background. And as the authors of this study say, these results contrast sharply with the reported observations of over 1,000 meditation-naive individuals tested previously. The point here is that this is apparently a strong top-down effect of attention on brain dynamics that has to do, again, with the internal self-generation of a particular attentional set. So dynamically, we could think of this in the following ways, that a conscious mental state is embodied in a dynamic pattern of large-scale brain activity. It emerges from the local neural activities, but also globally shapes and constrains them. I'm moving quickly towards the end as fast as I can. So we have a complex top-down, bottom-up pattern, and then we could speculate that contemplative mental training may create new types of order parameters or large-scale collective variables, collective dynamical patterns, for the ways that neural activity is dynamically coordinated from moment to moment that we know is necessary as a critical support for cognition. So the intentional enactment or volitional generation of meditative states may correspond to inducing these kinds of large-scale dynamical patterns in the brain. And just to visualize this kind of causation, we have then a complex, at any given moment of time in the brain, we have local interactions, but they're always within a global context that shapes and constrains those local interactions. And when we move from one state to another, like when you make the Necker cube flip, we have a state transition in which we have a new pattern of local and global activity. So coming towards the end now, I want to connect this back to what I said about intervention. Philosophers who talk about causation have proposed that we can think about causation in the following way to connect it with the idea of intervening. In this conceptualization, for something to be a cause of something else, for X to be a cause of Y, is for intervening on X to be a way of intervening on Y. By acting on X, you bring about Y. Interventions at a global level can bring about local effects, and interventions at a local level can bring about global effects. So if we think of causation this way, it allows us to say coherently that contemplative experience affects the brain by providing a distinct way of psychologically intervening or mentally intervening, experientially intervening on neurobiological processes at this global level of large-scale dynamical brain activity, which then has local consequences for quite specific things going on locally in the brain. So to come to an end, I want to go back to James. In the same chapter that I quoted at the beginning, James said, and this was actually at the end of the chapter when he's talking about the issue of free will, he says, the question of fact in the free will controversy relates solely to the amount of effort of attention which we can at any time put forth. Are the duration and intensity of this effort fixed functions of the object, or are they not? Well, I would submit, based on what I've presented to you today, that sustained attention or sustained voluntary attention is not a fixed function of the object. It's not stimulus driven from outside, for example. It's flexible and trainable, so it's not fixed. And it's an intrinsic function of mental activity and its embodiment in the brain, particularly when we look at this embodiment from a dynamical perspective. So it's not a function of the object. It's neither fixed nor a function of the object. It's flexible and trainable, and it's intrinsic to the endogenous workings of the mind and brain. Free will, then, is not exemption from causes and conditions, but is rather the flexible coordination of attention, intention, and emotion in skillful action. That's what it means to be free from a psychological and phenomenological perspective. And I will stop there, having gone over time. Thank you very much.
Trying to find the money to buy the ruby rods that a few people were selling so you could build your own laser at home. And of course, I couldn't afford it. They were fairly expensive at the time. But you all probably know that Dr. Charles Townes is the inventor and Nobel Prize winner for the maser and the laser. He's currently a professor at the graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley, and he's working on astrophysics with some wonderful experiments using lasers to stabilize telescopes that are separated by 100 meters or more and do interferometry on the using infrared to look at details down to being able to look at the disk of a star. So absolutely amazing work. He's won many other awards, but I'm not going to take his speaking time by telling you all those. He did win the Templeton Award in 2005, and he's engaged in research now with a number of students as well, working on the interaction of electromagnetic waves and matter. He's also a teacher and a government advisor. Dr. Townes.
Well, I was at Columbia here from 48 to 61. It was a great pleasure. And so I came back of my own free will. Very pleased to be back here and be with you. I'm going to talk about free will as I see it. And let me say right away that as I see it, free will is not consistent with our present understanding of science. Our present understanding of science simply does not allow free will. That doesn't mean I disbelieve it completely. Our science may not be complete. And frankly, I have reasonable confidence that I have some free will. I don't know that, however. But let me explain the position of science a little bit. I think almost everyone believes they can make free choices. I think I can move my hand this way or that way, of course. Of course, it's obvious. We all can make some choices. And even our instincts, we can choose against them. If I feel hungry, I can still decide whether or not to eat or not to eat. So it's not just instinctual. It's something that you presumably decide. Now, science, up till about 100 years ago, was completely deterministic. That is, the belief was that everything obeyed certain scientific laws in a very regular way. And you start out this way with certain initial conditions. The laws of science says exactly what's going to happen next. Early part of the last century, that view changed. And I think it's interesting how radically science can change when we understand new things. Quantum mechanics came along. Now, in quantum mechanics, if you send a molecule through a little hole, the molecule may go this way, may go this way, may go straight ahead. Even if you send it right straight through the center of the hole, it has a distribution of probability. It may go this way, this way, this way, this way. And we can't predict. We can say what the probability is. It'll go this way or this way, but we don't know exactly which way it goes. We make a measurement, we find it. Oh, it's gone here. We find it, oh, no, it's gone there. And the curious thing, too, is that human observations changes the quantum mechanical wave function. This is a wave function of how this thing is distributed. Suddenly, if we observe it, then it's in a particular position. We don't observe it, then it just has some chance of being here and some chance of being there and so on, and it's distributed. And its properties continue to depend on that distribution. Once we observe it, that changes it completely. Curious effect of humans. What's so special about humans? Our instrumentation itself, we think, doesn't do that. But quantum mechanics left an uncertainty as to what way the molecule is going and exactly what happens in the future. Now, Einstein said, well, of course, God doesn't take chances. Of course, there's something that determines which way it goes. We just have to find out what determines it. But Bell, well-known mathematician, Bell produces Bell's theorem, which tried to show, well, if you do certain experiments, you can test whether or not there's any unknown force that's determining where the molecule goes. The experiment was done by Aspect in France and some other people. Shows no, there's no unknown force. There can't be any unknown force. The molecule just goes this way or that way. And there's nothing that determines it. So while now science is not deterministic, that is, the future is not completely determined, nevertheless there's nothing that has any control over it. There's nothing that can have any control. So now we are made of molecules and atoms, and they're put together in certain ways. And here we are, and they behave in certain ways that are unpredictable, sort of roughly predictable. Broadly speaking, we can guess what's likely to happen, but we can't say exactly what's going to happen because of quantum mechanics. Even if we knew everything about those atoms and molecules that could be known, and exactly what our genes say and so on, exactly what our experience is, quantum mechanics says no, everything's not completely predictable. You can say what the probability is. Chances are pretty high it'll do this or that, but you don't know. So that's quantum mechanics. Now, you might say, well, doesn't that give us some chance of free will? Because things aren't predictable, so that gives us a choice? No. See, there's no unknown force. No unknown force, according to physics, and so there's nobody that has any choice. We're made of these atoms and molecules, and they proceed, do what the laws of physics tell them to do. And what we do then depends on that. And we have no control. We have no control, and nobody has any control. Now, some people have thought, well, this uncertainty of quantum mechanics, that allows a chance to God to have an effect, you see. But these tests say, no, there's no unknown force there. Maybe God comes in when we're not doing experiments only. But at least when we experiment, there's no God or nothing that's determining it, and things are not completely deterministic, even though there's nothing that has control, and we ourselves have no free will according to that. Now, what is it? How can we understand free will then? What are the possibilities? Well, the logical possibility in terms of our present knowledge is it's just imaginary. We think we have free will and we don't. Why should we imagine we have free will? Well, it may be evolutionary helpful. Maybe from an evolutionary point of view, very helpful for me to think that I have a free choice, and that's one of the things that affects my behavior and so on, and how I behave, and then hence what my survivability is and the survivability of my friends and whatnot. If I think I have free will, maybe that's useful, even though it's false. So that's one possibility. Now, another thing that's often discussed is emergence. Emergence can mean various things. It's very clear there are emergent phenomena. That is, if we put together a complex system, then very surprising things can happen, which we don't know how to predict very well. The weather is one kind of example. Weather, the winds and so on. The air is just made of molecules and billions of molecules and atoms. Can we predict the weather and the wind? No, we can say roughly what's likely to happen, but we can't say very precisely because it's too complex. Our present equations and our understanding don't allow us. In principle, we think we could predict quite a lot more in principle if we went to work on it very hard and put down more and more equations and more computers and so on. On the other hand, there's still the uncertain principle. The molecules may do a little of this or do a little of that, and there's still the uncertainty principle, and so it would not be completely predictable. But even if it were completely predictable, it's so complex that we can't predict it, and that's emergent phenomena. A lot of emergent phenomena. Very surprising things happen, and some of them, well, for example, let's take ice. Initial understanding of atoms, I don't think would necessarily say, oh, look, ice is going to have exactly this form. A very, very regular molecules placed in exactly this way. We think now our equations are good enough, we can sort of predict, yes, that's what it should have done. But as we get into more and more complications, we can't predict them. So emergence, yes, they're emergent phenomena, but that doesn't give us free will, really. On the other hand, that is an idea that's frequently used. Well, emergent, the things are so complex and things can come out of it that we are unexpected and we don't understand. No, free will cannot come out of that because free will, whatever phenomena emerge still have to obey the laws of science as we understand it. But nevertheless, that's a second kind of assumption. Now, a third assumption is that yes, free will is real. They're just phenomena here, new laws of science, which we don't yet know. Science has revolutionized itself many times in the past. Maybe there's some new laws, maybe there's a new dimension, for example. Many scientific theorists are playing with a very popular field now that involves many dimensions, 11 dimensions instead of the 4. We have 3 dimensions in space and 1 in time. We normally work with 4 dimensions. This is called string theory. String theory is very popular, very promising in a way. It hasn't predicted anything new, but it sort of seems to say, well, this makes a lot of new things possible. We put in new dimensions. So maybe there's a new dimension or something new there. And that's a third possibility. There's simply completely new phenomena we don't presently understand. That's not surprising. They may well be. A lot of things we don't understand at this point, and we recognize that. and I'll give some illustrations before very long. Now, people are doing experiments on free will, and it'd be great if we find out a way of testing whether or not we have free will or not. I think they're interesting experiments. I don't think any of them have been very clear-cut yet. Libet, for example, has made experiments showing that, well, talking about moving your fingers, there are signals that come kind of automatically from the nervous system to tell you move your finger this way or that way. A fraction of a second before the mind makes up a decision. And the mind can make a decision whether to accept that signal or not to. So there's an automatic signal that comes along, but then somehow there's a signal that comes from the brain that says, no, do it this way or that way. So the Betts experiments are interesting, but it doesn't really change anything. That somehow we think there's a decision there. We don't really see how or what it can be. Now, we've got other problems with humans, like consciousness. We have difficulty defining consciousness, I think. Oh, everybody knows what a conscious being is, of course, and everybody knows we have free will. Free will isn't acceptable. What is a conscious being? Well, let's see if we can define it. Well, conscious is it's some system which has a purpose. It has a purpose, and it can sense what's around it, and then act in accordance with that, what it senses and what its purpose is. Sure, that's a conscious creature then. But what about a mousetrap? A mousetrap does that. It has a purpose. It senses something, takes some action. Well, we know, of course, the mousetrap had it all planned. It all planned by somebody else that the mousetrap would do that. They give it its purpose. Maybe that's us. Maybe we've been all planned. So what is a conscious individual, and what's the difference? That's another one of the puzzles of human life. And now let's look at some of the many puzzles in science. I think many people don't recognize how puzzling science is. In many ways, science is just fantastic. What we've been able to find out and predict and understand, really, really amazing what we can predict and understand now. And we're learning more and more all the time. But there's some very basic things we don't understand. For example, quantum mechanics, we believe it works very well. General relativity, we believe it works very well. But in a particular way, the two are not consistent. We know they're not consistent. What can we do? Well, we believe each one, accept it, and inconsistent we just have to live with. Now, in addition to that, lots of other things. The beginning of the universe. Einstein, again, he was a very intuitive scientist, a wonderful scientist, and he initially couldn't believe quantum mechanics. Thought there had to be a determination. He thought, well, the universe, of course the universe has to always be here. The universe can't suddenly appear. There can't be some sudden creation from nothing. Now we know experimentally that there was a Big Bang. The universe did have a beginning. It began as a tiny, tiny little thing, too small for us to describe. Exploded, the Big Bang, only about 13.5 billion years ago. It's been growing ever since, and here we are. How did it begin? We don't really know. It had a beginning. You see, of course, these things also have an interaction on our philosophical and religious views. In religion, we think there was a beginning. The scientists all thought, well, most scientists thought, of course, it can't have a beginning. It could always be here. It can't start. But even Einstein was eventually convinced. Yes, the universe had a beginning, expanding and getting bigger and bigger. It's going to cool off and stop, or something else is going to happen. Now, in addition, there's dark matter. Dark matter? Well, we know that out there, the way the stars behave, something is pulling on them. The stars pull on themselves for gravity, but something else is pulling on them like gravity. And what is it? It has to be some new kind of matter that's out there that we don't know. We can't see it. We can see its effects, but we can't see it. And it's 20 times as plentiful as a matter that we do know. We know the stars and the atoms and the molecules, but dark matter, completely unknown what it is, it's 20 times more abundant. Sorry, I don't mean 20, I mean 4 times more abundant than the matter that we know. There's still another thing, dark energy. Now, dark energy that's pushing our universe apart, we've discovered quite recently. And if you try to say what that might be, people think energy and matter are similar. And if there's energy, there must be matter. And that matter is 20 times the matter that we know. So what we know is only about 5%. The matter we know is only about 5% out in the universe. Now, dark energy, one can argue about, is that really matter or not? But dark matter, those gravitational forces we see, it must be there. And what is it? And where is it? Well, we're looking hard. Can we ever detect it? What is it? Is it, again, a new dimension, you see, we're not understandable to us. Now, to what extent is our free will? To what extent is our brain have that same kind of problem? That we shouldn't expect to understand everything now. Let's understand as much as we can. Recognize what we understand doesn't allow us to have free will. That doesn't necessarily kill free will. Frankly, I think I have it. And I'm hopeful we'll find out more later. Now, another indication of how much we can understand, how much we can't, is Gödel's theorem. Gödel is a famous mathematician, and Gödel was able to prove, he said, well, in order to prove things, we make certain assumptions, and we use our logic. We deduce things from those assumptions, and then we test it to see whether that works, whether that's what we actually see. If it is, well then, yes, okay, that's fine. But what his mathematics showed was one can never prove that the assumptions we make are self-consistent. You can never prove the assumptions you make are self-consistent. You can make a new series of assumptions from which you can prove those, but then there's a new series of assumptions you can't prove those are self-consistent. So that says we never really prove anything. We make assumptions, we draw deductions from them, from logic and experiments and so on. That's very, very valuable, but we mustn't think that we understand everything. Now, of these 3 possibilities, I personally think the first is a logical one, that no, free will is not in accordance with science, and it's something we believe we have, and is useful from the point of view of development of humans and so on. It's very useful. And if I think I have free will, I'm likely to behave in a way that's helpful to you and to myself and so on. Okay. That's the explanation that is presently logical. On the other hand, my own intuition is there's more to it. There's much more we don't understand. Maybe additional dimensions here, additional phenomena. And where is the person, you see? This is another problem. Where is the person? We say, oh, well, somewhere up in the brain. Where is this thing that has free will? What part of the brain has free will? And where is the individual? Are we located up here somehow? Are we located up here somehow? Now, in addition to that, we have to ask ourselves, who is it has free will? We think of a newborn baby. We don't expect too many of just the right choices. Newborn baby, on the basis of free will, he has instinctive things like nursing properly and so on. But does a baby have free will? When does free will begin in humans? Is it when the embryo is formed? When a baby is born? What? No, generally free will we think, well, the person gets more and more free will as they develop. A baby doesn't have much free will. As it develops, it gets more and more free will, and eventually has more. And, well, there's a degree of free will then. And of course, a person who's mentally retarded or injured or crazy, we think, well, their free will is somehow gone. Is the person still there? To what extent is the person there? They don't have much free will. We generally think that. To what extent is the person there? Now, to what extent do animals have free will? We think of the humans as something special. Yeah, we humans are very, very special. It's clear we are different from most animals, but we're very similar in many ways to most animals. And our genetics is very similar and so on. Now I want to mention again, so far as unpredictability is concerned, and molecules and atoms can go in ways which are unpredictable. That means our genes can go in ways which are unpredictable. And our genes can change and so on, and our humans can change. We have no control. But anyhow, broadly, we have many similarities with animals. To what extent do they have free will? To what extent do they have consciousness? If we recognize that babies have some free will, it grows as they develop, to what extent do animals have free will? To what extent do they have moral responsibility? Babies don't have very much moral responsibility, we generally don't think, but as they grow older, they have more and more. To what extent do animals have moral responsibility, free will, and moral responsibility? We've got a lot of very deep questions there. I wish I could answer some of them. My hope is, let's keep trying. Let's keep trying. It may be very, very difficult. It may be the brain can never understand itself. Perhaps to understand something, you've got to be more complex than it is. Brain is very complex. And to understand something, maybe the system to understand has to be more complex than the thing it's understanding. So maybe the brain will never understand itself. But I'm hopeful that we'll understand more. So let's keep trying. And personally, I think we have free will. I think we have free will, and let's behave as if we do, and then that we have a responsibility to make the right decisions. Thank you.
Our final speaker in this session will be Piet. And Piet is an astrophysicist. He's at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. And I've gotten to know Piet over the last few years and becoming friends, especially through his work with a project that he calls the Ways of Knowing, where he's looking at different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding it, and extending that out to others as well through some virtual interaction websites, virtual reality interaction sites where discussions are held among different individuals who have these kinds of interests. So really looking forward to hearing what Piet has to say, and I'll let you give it a start.
So I guess there is no mic. I have to. So I have no free will of moving around. I have to be glued to this particular. That's not much fun. Can this go? Can we go? Can I take it off? Ah, yes. Oops. Let's keep trying. Oh, it's not. A little bit longer. Yeah?
How about this, Phil?
Ah, that's much better. Thank you.
They may not have it up yet. Let's see.
Okay.
Oh, it's on.
Hello, hello. Okay. Now I feel I have free will. This is much better. Let's keep trying. That was a wonderful way. Thank you, Charlie, for the beautiful talk. I do think that let's keep trying is the very theme of science. And it is amazing that science has made progress for about 12 generations now. I don't know of any human activity which has made continuous progress for 12 generations without getting stuck. And I think one of the wonderful things about science is that you get credit for crazy new ideas if they are interesting enough and crazy enough, as they sometimes say. And you get credit for shooting down ideas, for being very conservative. Somebody once said the pleasure of science is to proving other people wrong, including yourself. And indeed, if you have a great idea, it's also fun to try and poke holes in it and see that you are wrong. That's part of the game. So science is like fashion in the sense that you get brownie points for new ideas. And science is also like more conservative enterprises, like, for example, most forms of organized religion, where you get brownie points for defending the faith and for sticking to the old ideas, maybe in new forms, if you can do that. So in science, you get brownie points for being conservative and for being progressive at the same time. And I think that is ultimately the key of the fact that science has made progress without getting stuck for a few hundred years. Even so, a few hundred years is very, very short. Our written literature goes back a few thousand years, and the first cave paintings were made a few tens of thousands of years. So really, science is the young kid on the block as far as human enterprises go. And I wasn't here yesterday afternoon. I apologize for that. I had a conflicting schedule. I heard there were some fireworks. Is David here? Yeah, I heard there were some fireworks. I'm sorry I wasn't here, but I would like to hear a rerun at some point when I get a chance. I like to tell people that science is like is to other cultural activities like a teenager. Science is very young. It has all kinds of bold new ideas. It hasn't quite found its own limits yet. It can sometimes be a little bit arrogant, but often it's very stimulating. And I think many of you will recognize some of these aspects in scientists as well. Well, maybe in the discussion we can say something about that. I do think that science, at some point in the future, will have a lot to say about free will, about emergence and about the role of free will in emergence. But I don't think that in my lifetime we will get to a clear conclusion. Maybe some new developments will occur, but I don't think anything will really crystallize out. Since science is working on a timescale of hundreds of years, science is not something which you can hope to really see breakthroughs in a few years or tens of years. So the beauty of science is moderation. The scientist does not try to solve everything in their own lifetime. The key of science is to attack a problem which is doable. So you look at all the problems you could be interested in, and you take the first problem which hasn't been solved. Not number 5 or not number 10. You don't go into the candy store and get the best candy, which is the most attractive. Just you take the next candy. That is the beauty and the sadness of science. You don't get to choose the really great problems if the time is not ripe yet. If Einstein would have been born a few hundred years ago, he wouldn't have been able to do a relativity theory. The time was not ripe for that. So frankly, even though free will is a very interesting topic, I'm quite convinced that the time is not ripe for science to address that in a scientific way. It doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. I think it's very interesting to speculate and to see what might happen. But I think we have to wait a bit. So if I were to speculate to see how free will could be addressed in the future, then I would have to speculate about the future of science, the next few hundred years, maybe the next few thousand years. And how to do that? Well, the best way to think about the future of anything is to look back at the past, to take some main lines and try to project, to continue the dotted lines. So, if you look, how did science get started? Well, why did science get started? How could it be that suddenly people start with something extremely simple, like Galileo taking a few balls, dropping them, rolling them from an inclined plane, writing down the fact that if you throw something away, it falls in a parabola. What can be simpler than a parabola or the way things fall? What does that have to do with nature, with understanding of the material world? But somehow, Galileo and other people around that time, 15th, 16th century, somehow they had the intuition that if you really, really limit yourself to very, very simple things, you may get a deep enough insight which you can use to build up from there. And it is a very interesting question why the great cultures of India and China, and also the Islam culture a few hundred years before Galileo and Newton, why did they not produce a modern science of the type we now have? And I think probably the answer is that no culture has been as naive as the Europeans in the last millennium. No other culture have had the idea that you can split the world into subjects and objects, take only the objects, take only simple objects, take only simple behavior of the most simple objects in the most simple way, and that has anything to do with reality or with a deep understanding of reality. That is so incredibly naive. I mean, I can't blame the Chinese and the Indians that they didn't even try. I mean, I probably wouldn't have tried if somebody would have told me if I had lived in a different culture. So, somehow, I think it is the naivete of the Europeans which somehow got the ball rolling, literally, with Galileo, and resulted in a way in which, surprisingly, we can now describe almost everything we see around us. We don't know the Higgs particle, for example. We don't know where the string theory works, but that is so far from our bed or our kitchen. And this hasn't been very long. Even 100 years ago, if you would take some salt, some kitchen salt, and throw it in an open fire, and you would get this bright yellow flame, you would not know why. Nobody would know why that flame would be yellow. You could take a spectrum, get a few spectral lines, but nobody would know how spectral lines or why they were produced as they were. So even 100 years ago, even everyday phenomena we couldn't explain. And now we have the most detailed explanation of the phenomenology and detailed theories behind the phenomenology of the everyday material world. That is an enormous progress, which I think is absolutely phenomenal and amazing. But the big danger of any type of progress is that after you make enormous progress, you are so focused on where you have made progress in that you forget that there is anything beyond that. And today, when we are talking about the really big problems, I think this is a nice excuse to look further in the past and further in the future, and to think, okay, we now have, for all practical purposes, we seem to have the complete theory to explain chemistry, most of what is physics, the basic underlying mechanism of biology, although we need a lot more study to get the details out, but nobody has a feeling that there is a showstopper or that there is a big block. We have probably to work a number of decades or longer in getting systems biology sorted out, but it seems like it's in full swing and there don't seem to be any major showstoppers. So material reality seems to be pretty well under control. And we seem to have a pretty detailed description effective description, prediction, recipes for technology, etc. So what is left out? Well, maybe it is time to go back to the time of Galileo and to see what exactly he did. Science is empirical. So that means science is based on experience. You do an experiment and you see what the outcome is of the experiment. The experiment gives you a better theory. With the better theory, you can design better experiments, and the experiments help you to refine the theory, and the theory helps you to ask the right question to do better experiments. That is how science works. That is what we mean that science is empirical. It is based on experiments, on what you can measure, what you can experience. But let us go back. Let us really try to go back to square one from scratch. What does it mean to have experience? Well, we can start with language. Language helps us to deal with our experience, and every sentence we speak has generally a subject, a verb, and an object. I hold the mic. You hear something. Somebody does something. Whatever we do, there is a subject and an object, and there is an interaction. And if we see how science fits into this everyday language structure, we see immediately that science is studying only one out of the three elements. If you have subject, interaction, object, science is studying the object pole. It has spent 400 years making a very, very, very beautiful and detailed investigation of the object pole as if there was nothing else. And on the level of the object pole, it also has limited itself to what is called objective within the object pole. If I say, I see a dream, or I have a memory, then the memory is the object, or the dream is the object, but we don't consider that to be part of natural science, certainly not in physics or chemistry or whatever. So we limit ourselves to the objects and only to those objects which can be shared among other people. So in two steps, in two ways, we are reducing our experience to something relatively narrow, which we have then spent a few hundred years collectively to map out. And now that we have done that, and while we are filling in the last details, maybe it is time to go back and see, can we do anything like that on the level of the subject, on the level of the interaction between the object and the subject? Can we bring the subject into the picture? And can we also talk about those objects in our experience which are not so easily shared? If I want to analyze the physics of a table or a glass of water, that is easy to share. If I want to analyze other aspects which are not so easy to share, then we need a more complicated technology. So, in summary, I would say science has done an absolutely stunning and amazing job on getting the low-hanging fruit. And I don't mean that in any way negative. I think it is the right thing to start with the low-hanging fruit, because where else would you start? You have to build up things. But I think that in the next few hundred years, we will probably get a science of the, not only of the subject, but of the subject and the interaction and the object. And how that will work, I don't know. I mean, just like Galileo had no idea that there would be relativity theory, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, etc. Galileo had the intuition that this was the right direction to go into. And I think the next step is to go into the direction of getting a new science of subject, interaction, object, to get a truly empirical science where a true experience is completely filled in, not only looking at the object pole. So, well, we will see. We have to see how that goes. If I were to speculate even further, then I would say at some point, and that may be more than a few hundred years, that may be, I don't know, 1,000 years, whatever, As an astronomer, I'm used to think in terms of 1 million or 1 billion years, so 1,000 years is really nothing. At some point, I think we can go beyond subject interaction, object experience. I think we can step back from experience to the raw material of what is given to us in the most raw empirical way, namely our awareness. To talk about experience, we talk about X, about out, about something which in a way stands outside ourselves. But what we really start with is the awareness of ourselves as a subject, the awareness of other things and other people as objects for us, the awareness of the interaction. But can we look at the awareness itself? What does awareness teach us? Is there any way to talk about or to think about or to see or be aware of awareness? Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Science cannot help us. Science specifically has made a decision, and a very prudent, a very pragmatic decision, to take only the objective part of the object pole of experience. So if I ask, what is beyond objective, what is beyond the object pole, what is beyond experience, I'm 3 steps away of what science has started out to define as part of its terrain. So getting 3 steps away will take us 3 times, I would guess a few hundred years, if the past is teaches anything. But once we do that, I think we can say something about where science might want to go, say 1,000 years from now, 10,500, who knows? It's completely open. And the forerunners of what science will find there, we can find in various cultures where people have studied awareness in a purely phenomenological way. Not in the step-by-step, multi-generational approach which science is so good at, but in an attempt to get as much insight as possible in one lifetime. And that is where the great contemplative traditions in Europe, in Asia, in other places, have given us quite a bit of material about the phenomenology of awareness. And Alan has talked about this here and on other occasions. And there is an enormous body of literature. But nowadays, we don't learn much about that. Who of us gets exposed in education to medieval Christian mysticism? And who of us hears the word mysticism and thinks about anything beyond just being vague or foolish or quaint or whatever? But if any of you ever takes a few minutes to look at the writing of for example, a Christian medieval mystic, or anybody in the contemplative traditions in India, Tibet, China, Japan, then the first thing you notice is the quantitative approach. That is quite shocking. It's always a talk about the 7 stages of this, the 13 steps of that, the so many of this, the so many of that. And if you look why they do that, it is a phenomenological account. If you do the following type of exercise, then you find this step, this step, this step. So they start with phenomenology. And science also has started with phenomenology. Any type of science starts with experience. You describe what you find. You describe it as accurately as you can. Then you go from observation to theory. And then you use your theory to refine your observation and to get more fine distinctions. So the first step of a future science of awareness is there. There is lots and lots and lots of phenomenological material. And fortunately, more and more is available. You can do it from your home. Go to a website and type in a few words, and there you go. So much is there. It's just amazing. But our educational system is not preparing young people for the idea that there is anything at all there to look at. So that is the first step, I think, to start with as a change. So that is basically my view of free will and my view of emergence. Both free will and what it really means for something to emerge are things which are premature questions. They cannot possibly be answered by the current level of science or tomorrow's or the day after tomorrow. I think these questions will have to await a scientific approach and a scientific answer for at least a few centuries. Science hopefully will continue this way. At the same time, there is no reason for us not to try and get a preview and try to get some sense of what might happen. First of all, it's interesting, but secondly, by imagining what might happen, we can become a catalyst. If we don't imagine what will happen, it will take longer to make the next scientific revolution. Since whenever a whole new idea comes up, it takes time to convince people that this is a useful direction to go. So if we can start playing a little bit with how we can extrapolate the lines from the past, then we might be able to speed up the future developments, and we can lower the threshold to new ideas. So for that reason alone, I think it is good to speculate a little bit to the future of science. And there is a completely separate reason to do so. The completely separate reason is that those people who have an intuition and an interest in contemplation, mysticism, spirituality, whatever term you want to use for this, many of the people interested in these traditional topics find it extremely difficult to translate traditional teachings in the modern world. It seems that science is so much against all the metaphors, all the pictures, all the ideas which have been used in the past. It seems completely ridiculous. And actually, many scientists do think it is completely ridiculous to still hold on to an ancient view, an ancient faith, an ancient type of religion, because it all sounds so silly and quaint and not fitting at all. So I think that the way to rescue the phenomenological part, the experience part, the empirical part of the ancient traditions, the way to do that is to, first of all, go back to the source and see what did the people say, not the nearest preacher or the nearest interpreter who may or may not be right, but go back to the sources and see what people said who had really deep insight. How did they describe their experience? How did they describe their empirical method? And what can we take from there which we can possibly explore in our own life? And I think that question goes very well with the question of what is the future of science. I don't see any reason that science would suddenly get to a border and say, here you stop and here something else happens. I mean, what would it look like? If there would be a fence for scientific knowledge, why not go sit on the fence and look at the other side, and why not continue? I don't think there are two islands, an island of science and an island of other human knowledge. I mean, I, for one, am interested in both, so there is already a hinge between the two worlds, and I'm sure many of you have that. So I don't see any reason for science to stop. But I do see many reasons for science to take a long, long time to go from objects to subjects, to go beyond objects and subjects. So I think the fact that it is not yet on the horizon, that it is not in the charts, just means that science is still young and still growing. But if we want to look at the future of science, to help science and lower the threshold for new developments, and if we look for spiritual nourishment and ways to get the old ideas in new presentations, I think we can combine the two with completely different motivations. And in science, whenever you can combine two very different things, you have a sign that you might be in the right direction. Unification, or really finding what was already unified, but unifying it in human knowledge, is the key of science. So the fact that we can at the same time follow a program of rediscovering the truths of ancient traditions in a modern way and helping science to lower the threshold for its next major breakthroughs, I think is very encouraging. And that is basically what I feel motivated by and what I find the most interesting piece of research to do. And I think in my title I said something about methods and goals. What I mean there is that traditionally we have a distinction between pure and applied science. Applied science is a type of science trying to find a particular answer. You want to find a better technological application. So you apply your science in order to get a better steam engine, a better transistor, you build a quantum computer, you do all kinds of applied things. And then there is pure science, where you follow your own curiosity. And interestingly, the most important applications have come from pure science, not from applied science. It was always the purity of science which came with completely new ideas, which then came to completely unexpected applications, way beyond the limited horizon of applied science. So what people traditionally say is that science has a method. If you ask for an application, you are limited to a limited angle of questioning. If you just follow the method without thinking about application, you are more free, you have a much larger horizon, and then you can stumble upon new applications. But I would like to bring that one step further. Besides applied science, where you focus on the application, and pure science, where you focus on the method, I think there is a doubly pure science, a more pure science where you go beyond methods. And in fact, this is what scientists do all the time. When philosophers of science talk about science, or when historians talk about science, they talk about the method that scientists use. And in many cases, it's an interesting description, and I think often scientists can learn from them. It is nice to have a mirror and to see what scientists are doing and to have somebody else give a good description. I mean, I'm from Holland, so if I see somebody making jokes about Dutch people, then it is often interesting to see sort of like a mirror, like, oh, is that how we behave? I thought this was normal, but I guess other countries do it differently. So having people doing sociology of science or philosophy or history of science is very valuable. But we should not make the mistake that the method of science as described in that way is really science. The only thing we can say to what is science is what scientists do. That is ultimately the only definition. What scientists do is science. And we can approximate it with a description. We can approximate it by giving it the name of a method. But actually, scientists are opportunistic. Whenever scientists get stuck with a certain method, they are more than happy to drop the method, if necessary, and to extend it, to replace it, sometimes in a very radical way, like we heard about quantum mechanics, how radical that replacement was. And who cares that science officially is deterministic? Officially, I mean, 100 years ago. 100 years ago, if you would ask what is science, well, a cornerstone is that you can repeat experiments. And then quantum mechanics comes along and you cannot repeat experiments. If you take the same atom, you prepare it in the same way, it does not decay radioactively in the same way. So the cornerstone is gone, but who cares? We got quantum mechanics, which is so much more interesting and rich and, most importantly, closer to reality. So the notion of foundations of science is utterly wrong. In science, while we are doing science, the foundations have changed a number of times. Just imagine that you are sitting in your house and somebody is suddenly changing the foundations. I mean, that wouldn't be a very pleasant thing to happen, but science just goes on. Science floats by itself, and if somebody wants to replace the foundations, that is fine. Science, where the work is done, keeps going on. It has its own way of dealing with problems. So I think science will be changing not only its applications, but also its methods. And if we see how much science has changed its methods in the last 100 years, we can only guess what will happen in the next 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 years. I mean, why not? Why should it suddenly stop? Scientists typically talk about science having in mind a snapshot of science as it is now. But I think we should talk, if we talk about free will and these grand problems and these grand concepts, we really should talk about science in a much, much larger scope than the particular snapshot of science as it has been in our lifetime. So, how many more minutes do I have? Anytime. That's a very dangerous thing to say to an academic. Especially if to an astronomer, yeah? Okay. One way in which I am exploring this, and one way in which I would like to put my feelers out about what a future science can be, and to put my feelers out what a modern way of delving into the phenomenology of contemplation can be, practically for ourselves, for each other. One way to explore that, which I have started to do in the last year, is to use virtual worlds. Now, I would like to do a little poll here. So I know this is the last talk, so let us all wake up to the point of being able to raise our hands out of our own free will. Who of you have heard of the notion of second life? It's interesting. It's still about half. It doesn't seem to have changed much in the last year. Half the people have heard of it, half have not, roughly. Second question. Who of you has ever been in Second Life, have gotten an avatar and moved around at least once in Second Life? Yeah, about 8 or so people. Interesting. Third and last question, and then you can switch to listening again. Who of you have been in Second Life in the last week? One? One person has been in Second Life in the last week. That's very interesting. I'm always very curious about the distribution of people because there are about 300,000 people in the whole world who go into a Second Life almost every day, or at least once a week. And those 300 people are some of the most active and interesting, creative people who form a community and a type of network, which is just amazing. I had no idea until I plunged in a few months ago. Anyway, in the few minutes that I have, I cannot tell you much about the whole notion, but basically, Second Life is a virtual world. It is the same software as video games. There is a three-dimensional world where you go into and you identify yourself as a little puppet figure, an avatar. And very soon you become that avatar. You fall into it. It's an immersive experience. You are present, and there is co-presence with other people. You talk, you can do research, you can teach classes, you can build houses, you can quarrel whether the railroad line should go over your property or that of the neighbors. I mean, I'm not kidding. There is just an amazing way which combines playing house and playing with dolls, with academic research, with you name it, any type of normal human behavior you can find in Second Life. And in the last year, in various virtual worlds, most recently in Second Life, I have organized groups of astronomers to have meetings in journal clubs and to put their simulations in there. If you go into a planetarium, there is the dome, pretty much like here. This could be a nice planetarium. And you are real, your seats are real, but the stars are simulated. They are on the dome. But if you go into a virtual world, the chairs are simulated, you are an avatar, the stars are simulated, so there is no reason to sit in your chairs. In a virtual world, you start flying, you mingle with the stars, and if it is your own simulation, you inspect your simulation. It's a much better output than just looking at a printout or at a screen. And you literally can inspect what your stars are doing, and you can rerun the simulation, and the subject-object divide with a screen in between has dissolved. There is a very deep philosophical meaning to do science in a virtual world, where the subject-object split, which started with Galileo, has dropped. This is the topic for a whole separate talk, but I think 100 years from now, philosophers will mark the 2000 as the time that science really went beyond the subject-object split. And I haven't heard people talking about it. I think it's just too new, but in a few years this will become obvious. So, to end my talk, what I'm doing in that virtual world, besides doing astrophysics, which is fun by itself, is that I'm also starting with a group of friends, whoever is interested, an exploration of these very, very far questions. These questions of what can go beyond the subject-object split? How can we phenomenologically study our awareness? And I have called that play as being. To say it very, very briefly, we can, in various mythologies, in various traditions, in various contemplative worldviews, there is talk about whatever being is, the totality of reality, is playing us. And we can return the compliment by us playing being, in whatever way we can imagine that that might be. And this relates to what Alan Wallace talked about as, I would say, the goal as path. How did you say it? What was your formulation? Taking the fruition as the path. Yeah, the goal as path, the same idea. So if some of these traditions are right, and if it makes sense to not reach for deep insight, but to take the working hypothesis that the insight is already here and available, then the question is, how do we act it out? How do we play as being? I don't have time to talk about it, but if you're interested, there is a website which I started just yesterday, and we will be having daily meetings in Second Life starting tomorrow, April Fool's Day. That seemed like the perfect time to start it. And here is the website. And you probably cannot read it, but the website is playasbeing, one word, playasbeing.wordpress.com. But if you write down the main words and you do a Google, you should be able to find it too. Or go to my website and send me an email or whatever. You'll find your way there. Starting tomorrow, little groups, small groups of avatars will get together in a piece of land which I recently acquired there. And they will start chatting with each other about what it means to play as being. So you're all welcome to join me. Thank you.
No, we're going to... we'd like to have a small change in schedule, which I think will be a lot more fun. The idea would be to take now about a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll have the panelists from this recent session, and then open the questions to the other speakers from all the other sessions. So for about 15 or 20 minutes, we'll limit the discussion to the speakers from all the sessions with this latest panel, and then have a little bit of dialogue across the entire meeting. And then following that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And then after that, we have some very interesting closing remarks to follow as well. So if we could take now just about a 10-minute break, be back at 10 minutes after 4. And I'd like to start by asking Dr. Towns. He has a question to pose.
I have a question asked primarily to Professor Foote, but anybody who can answer it, I hope. The following. The laws of science turn out to be very specifically just exactly what's needed for us to be here. You see, the laws of gravity and the nuclear forces are just such that gravity pulls the nuclei together, and that can make the sun, they're just balanced in such a way that the sun can produce heat for us over billions of years, more or less steady, so on. And the laws of nuclear forces and electronics are just right so that we can have atoms of a large number of different types. We can have all the chemical elements. It has to be just right in order for that to exist. So on, just all through. It's remarkable. They're just right It has to be almost exactly that way for us to be here. Now, why are they that way?
Oh, that is a question I have to answer? Wow. If you had given me homework a few days ago, I could have tried to come up with an answer. But I think that the best explanation, I don't like to be captured, in case you hadn't noticed. The best explanation I know of is the anthropic principle, that the universe may be much larger than we think, and that of all the different niches in different universes, this is one which is useful for us. That would be my guess.
Lots of different universes, each with different laws of science.
Yeah?
Lots of different universes, each with different laws of science. Why do the laws vary from one universe to another?
Well, that was a big question when the anthropic idea was first put forward about 25 years ago. But now, surprisingly, string theory has given us the notion of the landscape of vacua. Even if string theory turns out to be right, there seems to be 10 to the 10 to the 10 to who knows what possible vacuum states to start with. And each of them can have different properties for particles. So that might be a very unexpected way to get into the idea of, have you heard of the multiverse? We used to talk about the universe, but now we talk about the multiverse, of which our universe is just one. It's a nice concept.
So you would accept the assumption that probably there's almost an infinite number of universes, and the one that turned out right is the one where we can be.
That seems like a very reasonable possibility. I mean, we don't know, but...
Postulate, interesting postulate, though.
But the interesting thing is, it is not completely unscientific, in the sense it is not completely untestable. It seems like if there are other universes where you cannot go, how can you test it? But one way to try and test it is to see, to look at all the properties of our universe, and if there are certain ranges of properties for which we can exist, you don't expect the choices to be all at the edge, at the top or at the bottom, but somewhere in the middle. And indeed, when the cosmological constant was discovered, it was somewhere in the middle of the allowable range, and that was after the idea of anthropic universes and multiverse was put forward. So in a weak way, you can chalk that up as 1-0 for anthropomorphic idea. Wouldn't you agree, or is that too far-fetched?
Well, no, I think it's a postulate, and just we can believe it if we wish. Otherwise, of course, many people think, oh well, the anthropic principle means the universe was planned this way.
No, that would be a very different thing.
That's distinctly religious kind of point of view.
This would be the opposite. It would be a natural selection of universes, not by letting the universes die off which don't select our criterion, but just those universes which don't support observers are not being observed. It sounds like a tautology, but it is actually an interesting statement. The fact that we can observe the universe means that the universe has to be such that it is observable. In other words, that it produces observers.
So now the floor is open for any of the speakers from any of the sessions. We have 2 mics over here. So just for the speakers right now, and then we'll open it to the general audience in a few minutes, but just to get the conversation going. So just the speakers to begin with, and then we'll open it to the general audience in just a minute.
I'm sorry.
So, Dr. Helpman.
So there's many things I could say in response to your talk, Piet, but I'll restrain myself and just ask one sort of technical question. You referred to the quantitative steps in various contemplative philosophies as, remarkably quantitative and also empirical. You used the word empirical. When Newton passed light through a prism, he saw 7 colors. But he didn't, of course, actually see 7 colors. He had a philosophical predisposition to see 7 colors because there were 7 tones in the Western musical scale, and he had that analogy when he was looking at light. So is it really fair to call these steps in contemplative philosophies empirical and not just imposed by some philosophical predisposition?
Thanks, David. That's an excellent question. And I think the answer is it's a mixture of both. I think that contemplatives are asking questions which are so incredibly much harder than the questions which physicists have asked so far. It is not only objects, it's objects and subjects. It's not only separate subjects and objects, it's about what goes beyond the subject-object split, that given the confusion, given the fact that in physics it took almost 100 years to really figure out what the quantity of motion was. Is the quantity of motion, is it linear or quadratic in velocity? And now we learn that as undergraduates, momentum is linear in velocity and kinetic energy is quadratic. But it took the half a century or more for people to figure that out. And then they thought, aha, okay, now you have separated what is really true and what we were confused about. So in contemplative empirical research, the confusion has to be even much larger than that. And I'm sure that many of the descriptions of so many steps here and so many steps there, if you really look into it, you can change the numbers a bit around and you can have other insights in it. But at the same time, whether you talk about 7 or 8 or 9 or 6 colors, you can still do a lot of phenomenology. You can see how projected light behaves if you superpose. You can see how paint behaves if you superpose it. I mean, Goethe did all kind of interesting experiments, even though he was not in the mainstream of physics, which later were seen as relevant. So phenomenology is interesting by itself, but it needs a scientific stage to separate what can really be kept for future generations. And by and large, many contemplative approaches have not had this multi-generational, step-by-step filtering, patiently filtering, letting things sediment, checking again and again, then going a small step further. There have been some stages, like in before the Islamic conquest of India in the 7th, 8th century in India, when tens of thousands of people in Buddhist universities have tried to make a type of phenomenological approach which really was sort of leading on from generation to generation, but that was maybe a few generations, and it was not as systematic as, I would say, as our current scientific approach, and it was not like for 12 generations as we have done in science. So I think it can be done, I think it should be done, I think it will be done, but so far, because the subject is so much more complex, and because we have never had until recently the scientific model, it hasn't been done. But I think now that science has shown to be so effective, I see no reason to not use the scientific method for other applications. And I don't mean the quantitative method. I don't mean the snapshot of current science, let alone 19th century science, and impose it on the social science. I mean the idea of getting brownie points for crazy new ideas and for being conservative, and the idea to have a peer group of people let it fight out without external criterion. Those two things, I think, could and should and will be applied in other fields.
Alan?
I'd like to pose 2 questions, if I may, especially since the other mic is vacant right now. The first is something of a challenge to you, Piet. You claim that science is what scientists do. And of course, semantically, you can define a word any way you like. But scientists do all kinds of things. Of course, they go water skiing, they go to the toilet, they bake potatoes. And so in that regard, I think that would fall apart pretty quickly. But in terms of truth claims made by scientists, I've gone to some pains to distinguish between the kind of articles of faith or metaphysical beliefs of scientific materialism as a metaphysical belief system, as opposed to the types of conclusions based upon empirical evidence, hypothesizing, hypothesis testing, theory formulating, and so forth. It seems to me there are 2 very different agendas that scientists engage in. And if you simply say that science is what scientists do, don't we run the danger of completely conflating the metaphysical assumptions that underlie a lot of scientific thinking, as opposed to the scientific conclusions that are based upon clear theory formulation and theory testing with observation and experiment?
The way I see this is that I think science is far more intelligent than scientists are. To make an extreme example, I think I'm more intelligent than the cells in my body. That's a little bit extreme, but whenever you look at some of the greatest scientists of the past, they had some great ideas, but they also had many ideas which were stuck in the mud, which were wrong, which we, as Max Planck said, we just have to wait till the old guard dies off. I mean, many scientists are not flexible enough to follow where science is leading. Remarkably, the combination of peer review, this both progressive and conservative element has created a multi-generational, multi-people way that if you have a critical mass of enough intelligent and dedicated scientists, then science can continue no matter how stuck in the mud each individual scientist has a danger of being. I have seen in my life so often that there was a scientific controversy, let's say Big Bang versus steady state or this versus that, and some people are flexible enough to change their mind, but many people never change their mind. Gate theories come and people hang on to the previous theories, they just have to die off, otherwise, I mean, they don't change their mind. Not everybody, but some people. So in that sense, I think science as a multi-generational activity really has, in a way, the mind of its own. I don't mean esoteric or metaphysical, but it has effectively the emergent property of being more than the individual scientist. And if you look at where the river is flowing, where the stream of science is going, then I think you see this extra, you can call it intelligence in some way, or creative in some way, and that is what I was talking about.
Thank you. Then the question, for which I certainly have no answer, is to raise two unsolved problems. They've been unsolved for a long time. One is the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, how we move from a probability function, a complete mathematical abstraction, and then a measurement takes place, made by an observer, and somehow we have a concrete reality of real particles someplace in space. The measurement problem, it's not clear to me that there's been any clear progress over the last 80 years. On the other hand, we have the hard problem in the mind-body issue in the cognitive sciences. What is it about these neuronal configurations inside the head that enables them to generate or even influence subjective mental states? It's not clear to me that any progress is being made on the hard problem either. The question here then is, and I'm addressing this to everyone on the panel, do you see a possibility or a likelihood that the measurement problem and the hard problem are both based upon perhaps some false dualistic assumptions, which may account in part for why they've been so intractable thus far, and do you see the solution of these as in any way being meaningfully interrelated?
I do see, but if the two of you want to
I'll say
respond
something
first.
quickly about the hard problem. I mean, I think that the hard problem of consciousness as it's standardly posed is entirely hostage to, in effect, a Cartesian conception of the physical and a Cartesian conception of the mental. So if you frame the problem as how objective matter in motion in the form of neurons could ever give rise to subjective private qualia, that's not a hard problem, that's an impossible problem. The very terms preclude there being any way of working effectively. So then the question is, well, what do you do? And it seems to me precisely what we need to do is to work in a phenomenological way on the side of experience, where we explore the nature of experience as it is subjectively, in a way that we can intersubjectively check and discuss, and that we do that in a way that we can make informative and guiding with regard to research on, say, the neural correlates, or not simply even just the neural correlates, but the broader physiological and biological nature of the human organism. And I think that's where we are right now. I think that's where we have to work. I think maybe in 300 years, to use a very short span of time on Piet's scale of things, we might then have a much deeper insight into those two poles in such a way that the hard problem won't be formulated in the way that we're thinking of it now. How, is that to say that the problem will be solved? No, I don't think it will be solved because, as I said, that problem isn't a solvable one given the terms. I think we will have a very different way of thinking about the mind-matter and subjective-objective relationship. That has phenomenology built into it as part of the nature of things.
You stimulated a couple thoughts for me, Evan, as well. One reason I think the emergence paradigm is interesting, and I have to agree with Charles that at first glance it's not really obvious how emergence could give you free will, because emergent systems are deterministic, and they do have these interesting properties of divergent trajectories and other things we could get into. But I do think there's much valuable about the emergence perspective. And one way to look at this is that if you take an approximation at one extreme, so if you think of a tribal people living in a vast forest, so there's a huge number of resources around, and they can visualize themselves as going out and trying to somehow conquer what is on the outside. So it's easy to always visualize something as the other because there's a vast pool of other. Once you shrink to the other end of the scale and put yourself inside of a very small community or inside of a family or some other sort of relationship, you begin to recognize that everything that's done affects everything else that's done. And so that happens on both sides. So it's much more difficult to objectify. If you hurt someone in your family, you're part of the family, and so it thus then hurts you. And we're seeing this, of course, in ecology, and ecological systems very much fit with this kind of emergence paradigm. And so when we think about science, and we think about, well, what have been the objectives of science? Well, the objectives of science have been to do prediction and control of systems. And that paradigm is very effective when you think you have a vast resource pool and you want to predict what's going to happen in it, and you're going to want to control what's happening in that because you're treating it almost like an infinite source. But once you begin to treat it like a finite source, then your objectives may change a little bit. And I think, for me, this is one reason that the emergence picture is one of many reasons, really, why it's so evocative right now, is because it does speak to us of this circular causality, this interrelationship, and the parts affecting the whole in the interaction. So, if you have any more comments about that,
I would just like to comment on how you define science. I would say science is an attempt to understand this universe and how it works, including humans, rather than to predict and control, but understand it. And we don't necessarily control it, but understanding generally does provide some control and prediction. But the understanding is the more basic thing.
Certainly in astronomy, we don't have much success yet with controlling galaxies.
Right. You can do a little prediction sometime, but you can't control. And that's not the objective, as I say. But science does result in control.
Can I say?
yeah.
I'll try to be very brief for Alan's last question. I think the fact that we do science purely on the object pole of experience, one reason that we have to take the object and the interaction and the subject is that we see that the object description is bursting at the seams. In quantum mechanics, if you try to describe things as objects, to your surprise, you need a measurement problem. Who ordered that? There is a subject role, either a human subject or a machine subject, but there is an interaction. One point. Second point, the brain studies. If you make a dictionary between your experience and electrochemical reactions, the fact that you have a dictionary means that there is an objective description and something else. Second place where it bursts at the seams, an objective thing. The third place is robotics. Why, if you look at science fiction stories of 50 years ago, no scientific story would predict that we have laptops and personal computers. All science fiction story would predict that there would be little robots cleaning the floor, etc. It's the opposite. Why? Laptops are objects. We know how to create objects. We don't yet know how to create subjects. We have not learned to know enough about what a subject is like to build a robot in our own image. So I think that this is one more sign that science will grow to have more of an understanding of subjects on a subject-like level, not on an objective description.
Maybe additionally, one additional point along that line is just the basic conundrum that science has now gotten to the point where we do want to look at consciousness and consider consciousness, consider the hard problem of consciousness. But the moment that we do that, we challenge the veil that we've created in order to do science that says that we're able to observe and there's an objective universe that we can observe. So we're already in a paradox there from the start with a hard problem. Oh, yes. Very good.
To be characteristically unprovocative, I have to say my definition of emergent phenomena is a label used as a smokescreen for ignorance and, more importantly, as a way to try to inject metaphysical concepts and non-scientific concepts into science. I think the things we label emergent phenomena are things that we don't understand, and it's perfectly fine to admit that we don't understand them. Furthermore, we may well not even have the tools to attempt to model them yet, or they may just be large calculation problems which we haven't bothered to do. But I think Charlie said it exactly right. The goal of science is understanding, and when we abandon that goal by characterizing some phenomena as lying somehow outside of that goal, I think we run the danger of injecting what I said yesterday, the substitution of the goal of meaning for understanding, which I think is not science.
I'd like to say something in response to that. The notion of emergence is precisely a notion that we can give some deep scientific content to because of advances in areas like nonlinear dynamics and neural coordination dynamics and pattern formation and self-organizing systems. I mean, these are all the areas of scientific study that try to characterize what it is that makes a phenomenon emergent, what the principles of pattern formation are in these areas. And what we find in all of these domains in different ways is a complex entanglement of upwards and downwards. I don't actually like those terms, but of complex system principles that involve local interactions, but governed, constrained, regulated, and embedded in global contexts that we can't, in our explanations, eliminate. If we want to understand the self-organizing character of the metabolism of a cell, we can map it out in terms of molecular pathways, but if we just look at it that way, then we lose the fact that it's embedded within a membrane and a whole system in a particular environmental context that completely shapes and organizes and regulates all of those molecular interactions so that they can happen in the way that they do. Now, there's nothing sort of mysterious there. It's scientifically intelligible, but it's not classically reductionist. It appeals to principles of pattern formation that do not fit into the classical scientific reductionist framework. That's a new kind of intelligibility. And that, for me, when I use the term emergence, that's what I'm referring to, is that body of knowledge. Now, I think it's an open question, and this actually connects to what Alan was asking, how far those developments, particularly in relation to some of the brain material that I was presenting, how far we can take those developments in terms of understanding mental processes and mental functions. I think that's actually not a question that we're in a position to be able to answer definitively at this point. But it's our best view in cognitive neuroscience, to my mind, of relating the brain to the mind at the right level of organization in terms of the principles of neural activity.
I'd like to follow up a little bit too. In a certain way, I'm very sympathetic to what you say, and I think that I know what you're reacting to, which I also react to, and that is that there's a trend that's happened probably in the last 30 years where lots and lots of ideas from science get co-opted into kind of popular culture talk. And the most heinous example of that, I think, is this movie, What the Bleep, if you've seen that, which is just a nightmare for a scientist. And unfortunately, this has happened to a certain degree with emergence. And so there are all these kind of ornaments. The term is being used very loosely, and there's all these sort of ornaments hanging on it. But what I would say on the other side of that, along with what Evan said, is is that these are very real phenomena with thousands and thousands of scientific papers published in physics journals, sociology journals, biology journals, chemistry journals. Pattern formation shows up everywhere. And all you have to do is develop a model for a Lorentz attractor on your computer. You can study it in detail. The mathematics of this have been worked out in great detail, and they have wonderful properties that are fascinating to study. They don't necessarily say anything mystical, but they're very, very interesting. They have extreme sensitivity to initial conditions. They have Lyapunov exponents that show divergent pathways. And so actually when you made the example yesterday about trying to calculate the future of the universe, if you look at an emergent system, what you find is the problem is actually many orders of magnitude harder than what you even said, because not only do you need to try to calculate the positions and follow all the positions, but if you look at the trajectories in any nonlinear system with instabilities, you find that they diverge with a Lyapunov exponent. And so what that means is that you need more and more and more information about the initial conditions to predict the future. And it becomes quite impossible to predict the future. And so that leads to a lot of very interesting things. I think there's very interesting things to study there that are not necessarily unscientific or whatnot, but we do get to interesting questions. If these things do bring out this precision of initial conditions, what does that mean? I mean, does it mean that quantum fluctuations might be important at some level? Does it mean other kinds of noise are important, and so forth? So I think there's a lot of good questions there, and that's part of it. So, oh yeah, Piet has a comment too.
I think I agree basically with what David said. If I understand him well enough, I may correct me if I'm wrong, that the phenomenology of, for example, phase transitions is very clear and very interesting. But that to say that we understand the principles of phase transition or the principle of pattern recognition on the level of the principles of laws of nature, I think that is not there yet. So I see the notion of emergence as a question, not as an answer. Is that what you, yeah?
So we should open it up for other questions from the audience at this point. Are there others who'd like to? Would you? Well, please
need
come
the
to
mic.
the microphones, please. Yeah, just come to the microphones. If you have a
Please go ahead.
My name is Alice Labrie, and I'd just like to say quickly that I was drawn to this conference by the subject of free will, but I was from my perspective and views on metaphysics. So I would just like to commend Mr. Hood. Did I pronounce it right? Forgive me. Piet.
Close enough. I'm from Holland. Yeah. Which is in between English and German.
Sorry, okay. I would just like to commend him for giving me hope, because very quickly I am considered a Creole from Louisiana, where although we are raised Catholics, we are very much steeped in mysticism. I've inherited the gifts of healing and so forth. So I'm very encouraged to hear that science at some point may explore this, and I quite invite you to use my family.
Thank you.
My name is Siddharth Malik, and first of all, thank you, everyone, because I come here with, no, I leave with more questions that I came up with, so that's good. First of all, and special thanks to Mr. Charlestown. I think it's my honor to hear you talk. You did mention about a theorem, and I'm no mathematician, about where the assumptions cannot be proven. What was the name of the theorem again? What was that name of the theorem? Gödel, okay.
Yes.
The theorem.
What
Gödel's
is the
theorem.
question about Gödel?
Yes, I guess that would be it. Question for our first speaker. I'm almost tempted to derive an analogy between that theorem and the kind of tools that are available today to study the brain, which is the brain. We use our brain to study the brain. What guarantee there is that our brain is a sufficient, consistent set of tools that will allow to explore our own brains fully?
Well, there's no guarantee.
Well, what sort of comfort level, I must rephrase?
Well, I think that you know, it's of our nature to explore the nature of reality. And one way that we explore that is through the development of science and the history that Piet outlined. And another way that our culture has lost touch with, but that other cultures have fostered, including some of our own cultures in the past, is to explore the mind phenomenologically, to explore experience phenomenologically through, for example, the contemplative traditions. Now, if you think of understanding as being able to stand outside of a system and have a complete, as it were, view from nowhere of that system, then I would say that's not the sort of understanding that we're striving for when we study the mind, because that makes no sense. We can't stand outside of the mind and study it. This connects actually to what Piet was talking about, that science in its Galilean form arose by bracketing off subjectivity and constituting a realm of objects that were then constituted as quantifiable and hence measurable and manipulable, and that's what has led to so much of the success of science. But when you try to turn that mode of investigation and that model of understanding back onto the mind, it becomes deeply paradoxical and unworkable, because what you're trying to study is what you bracketed off in the first place in order to create your mode of investigation. So we have to then think of understanding in new ways that have the mind built into them from the very beginning. Now, in fact, in science, the mind always was built in from the very beginning, because what does science come back to? It comes back to experience. Science without experience is impossible. But science tried to bracket that off. So now when we study the mind, we have to bring that back in. And the question is, how do we do that in a way that has some rigor and precision to it? And that's then where the appeal to phenomenology, and particularly the kind of phenomenology that we see in the contemplative traditions, comes in.
Sure, but that's not the first time this has happened where the object and the subject are coming together now. Quantum mechanics is a classic example, correct, Piet? Right? I mean, quantum mechanics is a classic example where object and subject were certainly brought back into the same mold.
Well, it's a place where a purely objective description doesn't work. You need to take into account with every object how you measure it, so there is an interaction coming with objects. So it's getting closer to the full-blown linguistic way of looking, if nothing else, at experience.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jason, and I'm a writer. It's a blessing to be here. I think this entire thing is a triumph of free will. Your minds are all amazingly beautiful. I'm blessed to be here. And it makes me think, yesterday I walked out of here just challenged and with a million questions and eager to come back. And William James was mentioned multiple times about, attention and then things colliding, and that's exactly what this is. I mean, you have all spent so much time and effort attending to what your each specific point, and it's just such a blessing. And I just wanted to look at, we're looking at free will and doesn't exist, and it seems like this is an inconclusive thing from all these different areas, from theology to science. But I think a real area of knowledge about this is the idea of slave will. People with OCD, people with drug abuse, and people who experience relief from that. Because I think it's very wonderful for me to sit here and eat cookies and listen to this incredibly intelligent dialogue, but there are people that can't leave the house because of alcoholism, or can't leave the couch because they're having suicidal thoughts. And I feel like this is just a blessing to contemplate the Dharma, to contemplate these teachings. But those people who somehow go from that person who's on the couch to attainment or some sort of spiritual path or scientific path, I think there's so much emergence just in that person's life. And I guess this isn't really a question, this is just gratitude. So thank you very much.
Actually, I want to say one quick thing, and then I'll give it to you. And one of the things I forgot to mention that's actually really important, that connects to what you were saying about the first neuroimaging study of meditation that I talked about, with the flexible shifting between two modes of self-awareness, is that part of the motivation for this is the treatment of depression. Because individuals who suffer from depression, among other things, get caught in ruminative, repetitive loops of thought that they can't get out of, and that are consuming. And through the kind of training that mindfulness-based stress reduction offers, for example, of being able to disengage from the sort of compulsiveness of that loop by returning attention to the present moment and simply being aware in a non-judgmental manner in the present moment, this could be very, and in fact, it has been explored in cognitive behavioral therapy. This could be very important for the treatment of depression. So, the motivation for this kind of work is precisely to bring about greater freedom in conditions of lack of freedom due to something like depression.
Yeah, thank you. I would say any type of knowledge can be liberating and restricting, and scientific knowledge, powerful as it is, has been enormously liberating for better and for worse in terms of technological applications, as well as giving us a wide horizon of the whole universe, microcosmos. But it also tends to be restrictive if you take it literally as a snapshot. And what the current scientists say about the current snapshot of science, it seems like there are all kinds of limitations. Just don't take it too literally and allow yourself to look a little bit beyond, because the next generation may have a different picture.
Move on to the next question.
My name is Richard Bennett, and I came up from Atlanta to be here, and it's been really wonderful. My question is a pretty simple one, and that is, we talked about the non-existence of free will and even the non-existence of self. And I think that's a fairly far out point of view for most people. And my question is, when sort of the scales fall from the eyes of someone who is a naive realist and they start to see that reality kind of exists in the relationship between subject and object, or to put it alternately, that the locus of reality is not outside, but rather more inside, what is the emotional reaction? Are there any studies to study exactly or generally what happens to people's feeling state as a result of realizing this?
That is for me, yeah? Well, I mean, there are so many emotional reactions with any type of research. I would say the most interesting aspect of delving into the phenomenology of contemplation, if I just wanted to use as a quick placeholder, is that it is possible to explore what it means to go beyond fear and beyond hope. We like to go beyond fear, and we like to drop fear, and part of our technology is to make ourselves more safe, that we can go beyond fear. But emotionally, if you don't want to go beyond hope, there is a very strong limit to what you can do about fear. But if you are willing to drop hope and fear together, then you can open yourself to the type of new sort of experience and maybe awareness beyond experience, which is totally different. But that's not an easy thing, and we have a lot of guidance from all kinds of traditions which tell us how we can explore that. It's not easy to say in a few words, but that would be one example.
From my own point of view, it's sort of difficult to accept and unpleasant, but requires a degree of courage and energy, which is a requirement if you're going to accept it.
Yes and no. The interesting thing is that when you go beyond dualities, it's always yes and no, or beyond yes and no. I mean, take the Chinese idea of Wu Wei, of not doing. It is beyond easy and hard. It is not easy, but it's not hard either, and that's the hard part, to find the easy way of dealing with things. And I'm not trying to make word jokes. I mean, there is something really there which I can see as clearly as a mathematical theorem, but it takes words and complicated dancing around before you can get communication and get the right wavelengths. But there is something really there, which is based on subtraction, not on addition. Everything we normally learn, learning a language, learning to play a musical instrument, all these things we learn by addition to our abilities. But what you are talking, what we are now talking about, is subtraction. We have to learn to subtract some of the ideas we have, and that's a completely different way of not acquiring knowledge, but to let go of what is blocking knowledge. It's reasonable that mystics of all ages and cultures talk about letting go and letting go of what blocks knowledge. It's a very different approach, but it's easy. It's at least as reasonable as the approaches we are normally dealing with. It doesn't work with studies of the object, but it works with other ways of knowing.
Thank you. Listening to you talk here in Low Library at Columbia, I'm particularly reminded of the wisdom of Sidney Morgenbesser, who once used to grace these halls the way you guys did, as we talk about, cognition and free will and these sorts of subjects. Morgenbesser's favorite critique of religion and science together was he would talk about explaining, and explaining away. In that spirit, I'd like to try and venture a conjecture which may be a bit confrontational. I don't intend it that way, but I am trying to get to something that I think is important.
Let me just say quickly, though, because we're just down to the last 2 minutes, probably.
All right, I'll be quick. That's fine. What are we really trying to get at with this conference, right? And what are we really trying to get at with science and free will? Because at the end of the day, when we talk about scientific explanation, whether in the traditional sense or whether in this evolving sense, and philosophers of science can talk about different, whether we're talking about Hempel or whether we're talking about Cartwright, whatever we're talking about, right? At the end of the day, science is traditionally turned on two particular things, right? Description, systematic description, with specific language, the language of mathematics, whatever, and prediction. And I would conjecture to you that much of what you're trying to problematize in this conference is in fact a non-problem. That is to say that even with gravity, okay, one of the oldest, Newtonian phenomena out there, as much as we can talk about gravitons or try to explain it with inverse square laws or whatever, we don't really understand it the way that a philosopher would say we understand something, like love or like free will, right? In other words, these are in many ways not really different paradigms, they're literally different ways of viewing the world. And whether you're a metaphysical realist, whether you see science as believing that there's clear predictability and from the past we can divine the future and there's deterministic laws, the question that I've thought about over and over listening to you guys speak is, why are we even having this conversation? In other words, why is free will something that should be understandable or amenable to begin with to the notions, whether it's newer science or older science? I thought your description of subject and object poles is very interesting. I've thought for a long time, for example, about whether or not, esoteric religions or Jainism or Nyingma Buddhism, or as we were talking about DBT earlier during the break, are something amenable to the modes of measurement and scientific analysis that have traditionally been restricted to the natural and objective world. But the question I run into over and over again is something that is essentially a human construction, in large part the baggage we have in the West of Judeo-Christianity, free will. Why should that have to be amenable to a completely different intellectual tradition? And I would appreciate it if one of you would try to defend that today.
I didn't understand the question.
My first reaction is to say, can you repeat that question again? But I hesitate to do it. It was a rather long question. Can you boil it down to one sentence?
Sure. Given the different underpinnings, the different histories, the different archaeologies, if you like to be postmodern, but I hate postmodernists, right? The different archaeologies of these completely different human traditions and achievements. Why are we here trying to understand, why is there a problem in terms of trying to understand free will, in terms of science? Why does a deterministic science in any way threaten a free will human being or human agency? Are these not simply completely uninterchangeable, I mean, to put it very simply, human traditions? And why should we let the two bother each other? That's the essence of what I'm saying, but that's not all I'm saying.
What's the question?
Do we have a shorter sentence?
I'll take a little crack at it. First of all, I think that's a perfectly valid point of view to hold. I mean, I think we all try to decide how we want to relate to these issues. The point I was trying to make yesterday with the introduction is that there are many issues that were once in a domain quite separated from science. I mean, first of all, if you go back far enough science and natural philosophy merged together and so forth. But if you just go back maybe 200 years ago or 150 years ago, there were many things that were in a domain that were separated from science. And so we had all these human, what do I say, qualities and so forth that we acknowledged, we respected, we revered, and people had various beliefs attached to them and so forth, but they were in that category. There was another category of matter. As a matter of fact, if you read a lot about the history of Newton, it appears that some of his idea of objectifying was just to keep himself out of hot water with the religious authorities. And so we did have this split. And now we're at a time when a lot of things are converging at once. First of all, science has advanced so far, and particularly the neurosciences, that we're beginning to look at the brain and understanding much more about the brain. And so many neuroscientists are making claims about territory that was once the domain only of philosophers and theologians. And so that's created a certain amount of conflict and caused reasons to look at these. Also, at the same time these things have happened, a number of different implications have come up, from the legal points that were discussed by some of the speakers to ethical issues and so forth. That's my opinion on why these things need to be looked at. I'm not saying it needs to be understood from a scientific point of view, but I think it's interesting to begin the discussion about what it means for science to collide with these other points of view and to begin talking about it. So, I don't know.
But insofar as we can't measure many of these things with scientific apparatus, is it a discussion that has a foreseeable end?
Okay, let's wind up here. We actually, our speaker has arrived, but thank you very much for the question. And
can I just add one much shorter question getting at the same thing?
Very quickly.
All right. It seems that the concept of free will is a very archaic Western sort of thing. I was just asking if each of you would be able to reformulate it into either a new name for this discussion of the present debate, or ask a question that sort of illustrates what we are going for. Since I do agree with Piet, I don't know how to say your last, but I don't want to mess it up.
Yes.
But it seems like the old question used to be, are we in control of our decision-making process? And modern neuroscience has shown us that we are not aware of everything. So that is like an old question. So what are some new questions? And if each of you could just go.
What is the new question?
What are some new questions?
I agree that I think the definition of posing free will later be seen to be wrongly posed. And if I were to give one word, I would say Wu Wei, not doing like in Taoism or in general in Chinese thought, but it's a long story. So I'll give a short answer.
Well, free will, the question is there something that can take some action and make some determination which is not preordained by what it's composed of? And if so, then there's some free will.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And are you going to?
Well, thank you all. I began this meeting and I have the honor to bring it to a close with a novel, I think to my experience, unprecedented gift of the university's president, who's asked and agreed to come and say a few words. So without any complicated introduction, because the man is the university to the world and is an extraordinarily interesting and talented president, President Lee Bollinger.
Thank you very much, Bob. I just have a few words to say. Reverend, it's good to see you. I first want to congratulate Bob on this conference and say that One of the things that you observe in coming to a new institution, as I did 5.5 years ago, is which people in the institution are most interested in taking up the most interesting questions and some of the most difficult questions, and trying to think about them in a true intellectual academic way. And Bob is one of those people here at this university whom I admire greatly for doing that. And this conference is simply a prime example. The subject of neuroscience and free will, I'm not sure that I have a great deal to really add. In thinking about this, I immediately, but because I come from a background of thinking about legal constitutional concepts like freedom of speech and freedom of the press, I am steeped in a tradition of thinking that makes free will sort of the cornerstone or a cornerstone of how we organize this part of society, that is law in particular, and in my own area, freedom of speech and press. You cannot read the jurisprudence of constitutional law and not feel that at its base there is the deepest assumption of we have free will. And yet, as I have become, one of the pleasures of being a university president is that you get to talk to just about everybody. And if you don't choose to talk to them, they often choose to talk with you, so you don't have much choice about the matter, but it's part of the great attraction of the role. And as I begin to talk to scientists, and in particular people doing work at the genetic and fundamental biological role, I realized that the ability of science coming from that direction to begin to challenge or help in thinking about some of these deepest assumptions, like I just said with respect to law and constitutional law about free will, that there was a possibility that there would be a point in time in which we would actually be able to do more than simply have a nice and interesting discussion about some of these most profound questions in human existence. And I can give specific examples of scientists who are thinking about risk and about addiction, and can take the genes of a risk-averse mouse and put them into another risk-seeking mouse and change their behavior, and vice versa. We also, I've talked to scientists who are doing work on potentially the genetic bases of antisocial behavior. And there are scientists in this room, I've seen some of them just looking around, whom I know this is old territory. And yet to someone from the outside, this seems profound. I know you think it's profound coming from the science side, but to those of us outside, the possibility that there's going to be an overlap where we can actually, as I said, do more than have very interesting discussions about something that we all realize we have no chance of really beginning to resolve, that reality is changing, or seems to be changing. To that end, when I came here, I thought it would be wonderful if we did some things that helped to try to see whether that gulf or that gap between people who do the kind of work I do and people who do the work in science could be resolved. And Columbia is a fantastic place because science here at the neuroscience level and beyond all related fields is so absolutely fantastic. So the Mind-Brain Behavior Institute, which will be one of the first facilities put up in Manhattanville, the new campus, will be devoted to, in part, to exploring exactly this question. So I just thought I would give that personal reflection coming from my own field and touching up against that of neuroscience and the biological fields and where it has led me and the incredible excitement that one feels as at the possibilities here. So again, thank you Bob for letting me say this, and congratulations on the symposium. And it is a delight to precede Reverend Forbes, whom I have admired also since I came here, as an incredibly eloquent voice and a very powerful voice on matters that touch us all on any area. And he has been a very special person to be part of our discussions as we have thought about Manhattanville and the new campus and how to think about that. And I want to thank him publicly here for sharing his perspectives and wisdom on that. So thank you very much.
So Piet taught me to take advantage of the dissociation from time and space of the internet, and so I looked up Ecclesiastes on my little Palm Pilot, and I see in Ecclesiastes 12:12, and further by these my son be admonished, of the making of books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. So with that in mind, and seeing that the four corners of the curriculum in this building are medicine, law, philosophy, and theology, I think it's fitting to ask my friend Jeff Slade, a Master of Divinity student from Union and a good friend and former student of mine, to introduce Reverend Jim Forbes to close this meeting. Jeff.
It's a distinct honor for me to participate in this conference as a representative of the Riverside Church in New York City. For more than 75 years, our church has existed on Morningside Heights as a beacon of progressive Christianity in the city, in the nation, and the world. Indeed, it was John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Harry Emerson Fosdick who built this church on Morningside Heights, in part because of its proximity to Columbia University. Yet I think it's fair to say that while relationships between the two institutions have always been at least cordial, there's not been a great deal of interaction or cross-fertilization for the past 75 years. One prominent counterexample was Charles Towns, who told me he was in fact a deacon at Riverside Church while he was a professor at Columbia. Speaking for myself, though, although I came to Morningside Heights more than 40 years ago as a student at Union Seminary, and although I've been a very active member of Riverside Church for more than 20 years, and I was chair of the church council for a half-decade, I have to admit I'd never been in this room until yesterday. I did spend some time just outside this room in the spring of 1968, but that's another story. But now that Bob Pollack and Cynthia Peabody and the entire CSSR have come in residence to Riverside Church, I think that a whole new relationship is being born, and I, for one, am extremely grateful. Now let me turn to the task at hand to introduce my pastor, the Reverend Dr. James Alexander Forbes, Jr. For almost 20 years, Jim Forbes served as the senior minister of the Riverside Church, longer than Harry Emerson Fosdick himself. Dr. Forbes retired last year from that position, and he's now heading up the Healing of the Nations Foundation, continuing his work as one of America's foremost religious leaders in an even larger context. Dr. Forbes has been recognized as one of the best preachers in the entire English-speaking world, and I'm sure that you'll get a glimpse of that in just a moment. For many years, he was an academic colleague on Morningside Heights. He was the Joe Engel Professor of Preaching at Union Theological Seminary, whose past president, Don Shriver, is sitting back there. And I can testify that he is a well-grounded theologian as well as a distinguished preacher. But let me add one element to the mix, one that is little known, but should be particularly appreciated in this context. Before he committed himself to a life in the church, Jim Forbes was a chemistry major at Howard University. So now I ask you to welcome our final speaker, someone well-grounded in the theological as well as the scientific worlds, Dr. James A. Forbes, Jr.
I am honored to have the opportunity to come to participate in a conversation which in some times past would have been obviously adversarial for certain religious leaders, as they were even raising the question as to whether there is such a thing as free will. But today, it is not adversarial at all. It was Elton Trueblood, that Quaker saint, a weighty friend they would call him, who in a book entitled The Conjunct Life said that the most important word in the Bible is and, A-N-D. Out of the treasure you will bring both old and new. So in the discussion about science and religion, I am hovering most of the time right in that space called and. And of course, if Don Shriver and Peggy Shriver are your friends, you finally get to meet Bob Pollack. And he invites you to become a living expression of the valuing of and, so that the Center for the Study of Science and Religion gets concretized in our relationship and in our conversations. And even when he is not around, when I would tend to start pulpiteering and speaking, he's over my left or right shoulder saying, "Are you sure that the claim you are making out of dogmatics can continue to be sustained if there is conversation with those of us who approach it from the perspective of molecular biology?" So thank you very much for getting me accustomed to that. Let me tell you what I want to do in the very brief time that I'm going to stand before you. This conference wears you out, I am sure. So first of all, let me tell you that when I was called to the Riverside Church in 1989, there was a friend of mine whose name was Jenna Ray McNeil. And Jenna Ray McNeil spent some time trying to convince us that the most important thing for life was the will. So I started to read a prayer, but I'm not going to read this prayer, from the book from my professor friend from Union Seminary, Professor James Washington, in a book called Conversations with God. In this book, you discover out of the African American experience, most of these prayers somewhere along the line either talks about, "Lord, I'm willing to do your will." Even the prayers constantly reflect on Jesus' prayer, "Not my will, but thine be done." And yet at the same time, you take it back and say, "Lord, I will to do what you want me to do." And in my tradition, in which I was brought up, there was a strong emphasis on if you're going to live the holy life, what you've got to do is to conquer the impulses of the body so that you can consent to the demand of the will and of the spirit. Well, let me explain to you what I have done. I have tried to figure out, after looking over the papers to be presented here, to say how a pastor who has to deal with the problems of day to day finds the benefit from the kind of conversation that has gone on here. So let me just tell you where I start this out. If I were going to give a three-part sermon, which I am not, it would have these major points. First of all, the first point would be the free will assumptions informing my faith, which is to say, when I thought about it, most of all of my years of ministry had presumptions about the freedom of the will. Then the second point would be the informing of my assumptions about free will from neuroscience, or at least from the scientific understandings of the day. And the third point would be the faith that informs my sense of freedom and responsibility. Let me quickly read what I put down here. I said that my upbringing as a kid in Southern religion, Black Pentecostal religion, was heavy on how powerful the will of man, and they never said men or women in those days. And one of my favorite theologians, who was a pastor as well, Howard Thurman, always talked about how it was important for us to connect with the nerve center of consent. That was a powerful Thurman-esque concept, that all of us have this nerve center of consent by which we can say yes to the good we know we ought to do and no to the things that would be destructive of our lives and of community. My faith was formed that way. And of course, this sense was that actually, if you get in touch with the nerve center of consent, they did not use these words then, you would discover that we are hardwired for doing right versus wrong. But the problem is that the body, it was a strong anti-body tradition that I was a part of, that the impulses of the body will come between the nerve center of consent and your instinctive, hardwired moral sense of what was right to do. That was how I grew up. And therefore, the real problem was developing enough discipline to keep the body, its impulses. We didn't much talk about endocrines and all of that stuff in those days, but how to keep the flesh from contaminating our sense of the right and wrong so that the nerve center of consent would always be on the Lord's side. However, in prayerfulness, we were taught that if you are not careful, in addition to impulses in the body being bad, socks not good, in addition to the body and its impulses, you would also discover that there's such a thing prowling around the earth called the devil. You will remember, some of you, Flip Wilson, who in the midst of moral failings would also say, the devil made me do it. So discipline involves not only controlling the impulses inside, but being watchful lest the devil creep up on your blind side and make you do the wrong thing. Well, how do you do this? Well, you work hard, and through prayer and fasting, and since there's the devil on one side with a dualistic understanding, there is also the spirit on the other side who helps you watch out for where the devil is and gives you power to resist the impulses. Well, in addition to that, you can find, as the people said, your sense of moral behavior is increased really to a great degree by being in community. where the Wesleyan concept of being in the class where the job of each person is to watch out for your soul. So that if you didn't see the devil coming, or if you did not watch out for the impulses, you would then find that the community would watch out for your soul and tell you when you were going wrong. That's the way I grew up, brothers and sisters. That feeling of free will. You got to work on all of these vectors that finally would give you the capacity to say yes from the nerve center of consent. However, I made the mistake of going to Union Theological Seminary, where Don Schreiber was not at that time the president. But when I went to Union, I want you to know, President Schreiber, that I dropped one course while I was there. And the course that I dropped was the course taught by Reinhold Niebuhr. Because in Reinhold Niebuhr's early classes, the brother talked about a possible impossibility and talked about love as being almost there, and then used the Lutheran concept that you could be justified and a sinner at the same time. And a southern boy from Raleigh, North Carolina, who believed that the will was so strong, if reinforced by the Spirit, you would be able to always do what was right. I didn't drop that course just because the reading list was too long. It was that there was a crisis between a person who talked about the fact that our wills are not nearly as free as we think, nor are they as pure as we would seem to want to suggest, nor is it the case that if you fail as an individual, just get in a group, because in moral man and immoral society, he says it's hard enough for individuals to have a will to do the right, but collect them into some kind of grouping, that the group in the society is likely to even flunk worse than the individual in terms of the freedom of the will. Though that concept has been challenged, it is no longer clear that collectivities are more evil than individuals necessarily, only their means of implementing whatever the impulses are may be greater than the individual. Anyway, having gone to Union Theological Seminary and studying with Niebuhr and then studying with Meilenberg, who talked about Forbes, there's a problem with the way you've been brought up, brother. You have the concept that there's the body, and then there's the mind, and then there's the spirit. It says, if you really understand your Hebraic roots, there is the unity of personality. And if you are a distinct entity, body, mind, and spirit work together. I remember writing down in the class, pneumopsychosomatica, namely it's one word. It is not the socks separated, nor the psyche separated, nor the spirit pneuma separated, that whatever we are, each piece participates, and some days you don't know whether it's working on a swivel system whereby the body does it and the mind goes along, or whether the mind says it in the body and the spirit come traveling along. I learned in that space that there is extraordinary complexity in moral motivation and behavior. So now, the question, what have I learned as I've tried to be open to what the scientists have been saying? And this is what I've learned, and I want to tell you what I've learned, and then I want to do two things. One is to say thanks, and then secondly, to make a call for help. But I'll make it very clear what this is about. I think I've learned that there is no longer a distinct fixed center, even as Brother Thurman suggested. It may be, but it is not a fixed place from which one can say, I will, and therefore it is done, without acknowledging that when you said the I will, perhaps you do not know whether that's the beginning of it or whether the will is just seconding a motion that has been made in other arenas of one's life. I have learned that the serious limits must be established with respect to volitional mechanisms. That's hard, but I've learned it. That is to say, whenever we finally say, I will, that simple arithmetic won't do. Even calculus won't do. It takes higher mathematics, a term that Harry Emerson Fosdick loved, higher mathematics to really say this happened with this particular set of causative factors. I think I've learned that in regards to the need perceived in the self to control, that sometimes, and I think the scientists would allow us this, that if we have illusions of greater control than may actually be the case, sometimes that can serve positively for the things we would wish to achieve as human beings. I've also learned that we cannot yet put the catalog together, but that all of us are highly susceptible to mechanisms of manipulation. And the only question is how we would wish to manipulate, and question is to what extent can even we will, apart from the social context in which we found ourselves, with respect to what we wish to do with our capacities to manipulate. And then I get the impression from the scientists that individualism, whether it's rugged or refined, is greatly overrated, that we are embedded and that we are matrixed in ways that we do not understand, and therefore do not really think that the Lone Ranger is capable of being heroic all by himself. And I think I've learned that the will to live and the will to power sometimes contaminated, if you would use that word, by the will to death, that's some stuff that probably has a lot to do with the will. Now, here's what I want to do. Thank you. I want to say thank you because I found out that the religion if I did wrong, I had the feeling that if I just said no, it would have been all right. Thank you, scientists, for helping me to understand, not that I cannot be a responsible individual, but I may define it with less dogmatism than had been my tendency. I also have this sense that in regards to the notion of a will, if it doesn't jibe with what you think you want, that denial of reality becomes a survival mechanism that is destructive. Survival mechanism that is destructive. I've also learned that we human beings ought to be aware that we need liberation from the projections onto God or onto the devil. That maybe when we have a need to create these realities, and we still believe that there are things out there, we have not yet reached the higher level of mathematics to describe them. And maybe one day we will, and maybe one day we will not, but that we should stop so easily projecting on God out there or the devil over there. And I think what I believe is around is that my tradition had me with the illusions of purity. And the question that I had to finally learn is, if you manage to be as pure as your ideology would have you think you could be, how much of life would you have flushed down the drain in the process? And lastly, thank you for delivering most of us new preachers from such a determined judgmentalism, because the truth is, most preachers spend most of their time trying to manipulate, or shall I say, inspire people to use their free will to do what the preacher is talking about. Now I want to close by saying thank you. I've given my thanks, and now I want to tell you what kind of help I need from you scientists, because it's an and kind of thing, Bob. I just preached for Jeremiah Wright last Sunday in Chicago. There's a whole lot of conversation going on during this year of the presidential campaign. And I am trying to figure out, are people free not to be racist, not to be sexist, not to be, as it were, self-congratulatory when they come up with the highfalutin rhetoric. I now know that shame might not get it done, guilt might not get it done, judgment might not get it done. What is the emerging insight about how people, for the sake of community, for the sake of the enjoyment of the abundant life, what limits the power of ideologies, of race, of gender, and even of religion? Black religion, that's a strange cultic experience. They get emotional even up in there. They use bad words sometimes. What do we know about the way to advance our society so that whatever will is left, it is used to build up community, or as Dr. King, whose death date we will celebrate and commemorate and commiserate on the 4th of April, what lets us find our way until we discover more about what really willed us into what we are? What will help us in regards to that? And my work now is no longer pastor. I'll close my notes up. I'm now working to try to bring about healing in the nation. It's a post-retirement light vocation. And what I have said is that I am calling people from all around the world to become a leaf from both the Ezekiel passage that says the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nation, and then the Revelation says that there's fruit on the tree for every month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nation. I'm going to keep reading neurobiology, and I'm going to keep listening to the scientists. Can you help me figure out how to help such minuscule impulses that feel like freedom of the will? Can you help me figure out how could we who are in religion use our energy in the light of the science that you have uncovered for us, such that it will incline people to be conscientious about their health, holistically understood, and willing and ready to invest in the health of others? If you can help me do that, then all of the reading and trying to understand what these words are you all are talking about will have been worth the while. Let me close this way. On Easter Sunday, when I was at Jeremiah Wright's church, I took what I would call a tactical approach to talking about Easter. Because in the light of neuroscience, I heard the words differently on the cross when it says, "It is finished," meaning that everything necessary or the causation that would cause us to be what God would have us be, it's all finished. Then where does the human being have a will or any kind of control or any sense of agency? And this is my answer, and then I'm sitting down. I answered them that when Jesus said it is finished, that you have to spell that out, and it says F-I-N-I-S-H-E-D, period. I don't know how much will there is, but I have the feeling that right between the D of finished and the period, there is sufficient agency for us to at least have the illusion that may turn out to be foundational truth, that a partnership between the totality of reality and our own, shall I call it, trace of self-will and free will, right between the D and the dot, there's enough room for us to be both religious and responsible to our brothers and sisters around the world. God bless you.